Welcome to the Fairbanks North Star Borough Joint Assembly and School Board meeting. I'm calling this meeting to order, 6 o'clock, 5:59, whichever you want to use. Our mission statement is our mission is to provide an excellent and equitable education in a safe, supported environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Sharon, can you call the roll?
For the Assembly, Ms. Berman-Williams.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
Mr. Gray.
Here.
Mr. Wojcicki.
Here.
Ms. Likey.
Here.
Ms. Major is expected. Mr. Quist.
Here.
Ms. Sanford. Here. Mr. Tackey.
Here.
From the School Board, Mrs. Sanderson.
Here.
Mr. Rice.
Here.
Mrs. Lambert.
Here.
Mrs. McConnell is excused. Mr. Marati. Here. Mr. Doran.
Here.
Mrs. Dominique.
Here.
A quorum has been established for both the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly and the School Board.
And I would like for everyone here to get to know who's who and what's what. If we can just go around and just tell each one, you know, your assembly members, but how long you've been on the assembly. Just a few brief words to get started.
Can we start?
Yes.
All right. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Cooper. I've been on the Assembly for 3 years now, well, I guess entering my 4th year, and I am the Finance Committee Chair, and for the last 2 weeks, the Acting Presiding Officer, so filling in.
Okay. Mr. Gray?
Andrew Gray, I've been on the Assembly for 2 years.
Leah Berman-Williams, I've been on the Assembly for 1 week.
Mr. Williams?
Jim Williams.
Ms. Bradley? Mr. Doran?
Jim Doran. This is my start of my 2nd year on the school board.
Herbert, Director of Accounting.
Andy DeGraw, Chief Operations Officer.
Allison Lambert for 5 years on the board.
Sean Tackey, I'm Borough Assembly member for 2 years, entering my 3rd.
Erin Marati, I am brand new to the school board.
Christopher Quist, Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly, just starting my 5th year.
John Rice, 10 years on school board.
Aaron Lojeski, I've been on the Assembly for 1 year.
Liz Lake, I've been on the Assembly for 1 week.
Toya Sanderson, school
board.
Rice Ward Borough Mayor 1 week.
Karen Dvorak, Superintendent, starting my 5th year.
Okay. Well, I guess we can get started. And right off the top, I believe we want to pass it off to you, Dr. Gaborik.
Thanks. Well, I just want to welcome everybody. I'm really appreciative of all of the members of the board, I believe, and almost all the members of the Assembly being here. When we scheduled this last May, we were thinking that it had been, I think, 3 years since we'd had a joint work session on budget, and that would be a great opportunity to have a joint work session again, knowing at that time even that there would be potential changes on both bodies. And so a good opportunity, and then, of course, with the ordinance as well that recently came up, a good opportunity to talk about that. So Andy DeGraw, who is 3 months, I think, into his job, maybe a little bit longer, as our Chief Operations Officer, has put together a great presentation tonight. And our intent is to walk through that, but to have dialogue and questions as we go through. So stop him at any moment if you have any questions or want to dive deeper into any particular topic. And the goal is clarity and understanding of district budget processes. Again, when we planned this, we thought it would just be good to outline our process and timelines and how that blends with the borough and sort of the state overlay. And then we'll just take the dialogue where it goes from there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. DeGraw.
Tie mic here, is that working? It is? Okay. Does it need to be louder? Can everybody hear me? How about that? I'm just going to use this. All right, how about that? Is that good? All right, thank you, Dr. Gaborik. Again, my name is Andy DeGraw. I'm not just shy of 3 months here into the position, and it's actually exciting for me to hear a few people that have less familiarity or experience than I do. So that kind of gives me a little not so quite a feeling of being not in the know. So appreciate the opportunity to go through some different processes and just have this dialogue. I'm new to the conversation, but I've heard the history. I've heard a lot of the issues that have been on the table between the two organizations over the past several years, and I guess I would just want to say that for my part, I'm ready and willing and want to have an open dialogue on my part to be able to bridge that divide and the gap, whatever gap is there. I'm willing to work into the equation as much transparency, information sharing as I can on my part to be able to facilitate a good working relationship. So kind of a general outline that I'm going to follow in my presentation. First, we'll go over the budget process that the district follows. Then also we'll go over the three main funding sources that the district receives revenue from, go into the details of those sources. Then we'll talk about fund balance. I'll kind of get to the why, but also the how. I think it's an important conversation to have. Not only the why philosophically, why the Board of Education has adopted this approach, but also how it occurred. I think that's an important conversation to have, and I hope that'll clear up just this, again, putting everything out on the table will clear up some maybe misunderstandings or miscommunication that's been there in the past. And then we'll finish up my presentation a little bit on touching on the financial ramifications of the proposed ordinance as we see it, and I've updated it just as of late to reflect, I believe it was Assemblyman Cooper's amendment to the ordinance. My numbers hopefully will reflect that amendment. So without further ado, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but if there's questions, I think we're working in a somewhat of an informal environment where questions can be kind of thrown out there as you think of things. Don't hesitate to.
We just want to make sure you're being recognized, so please just hold up your hand and I'll call on you when I see you.
Perfect.
If I missed the order, forgive me.
Okay.
But we'll just work it in that order.
All right. So this is just a real general illustration of our overall budget process. And the next slide will kind of show more of a calendar of this approach. We begin by identifying budget priorities in cohort with the Board of Education, and then we start identifying those priorities internally, and then we begin to develop the budget internally after we identify priorities. At that point, we have opportunities for community engagement that occurs through Board of Education regular meetings, as well as social media, surveys, et cetera. And then the budget approval process begins, and that is where the Borough Assembly comes into the equation. Goes through a budget approval process to identify local contribution, and then finally the budget adoption. And that usually, the deadline for that is July, but the district usually attempts to have that process complete by the end of May. And this, again, is a general calendar of those activities. The district's first iteration of the budget comes out February 1. And so this process here, right through here, is all of the internal goings on, priorities, budget development, and so forth. Up to February 1, that's when the district presents its proposed budget to the Board of Education. Then the board, as well as district administration, continues working the budget, and then by April 1, right here, that's when the district sends its recommended budget to the Borough Assembly for the Assembly's consideration. And then typically the Borough Assembly works that budget through the month of April and maybe the beginning part of May. And then the district is its intent to wrap up If there's any, after the borough approves the budget, the district might take another month or so to put finishing touches on the recommended budget, and it approves the final approved budget that it sends on to the state of Alaska. So that's the general timeline. Key dates, kind of to summarize that process, the key dates, again, the proposed budget. Internally, the district presents that proposed budget on February 1, and then recommended goes to the Borough Assembly on April 1. The local contribution is typically set somewhere around the beginning of May. The final approved budget is approved by the Board of Education somewhere right around the end of May or beginning of June. Moving on to the three main revenue sources.
Hold up a second. Yeah. Mr. Lejeski.
Well, I'll hold my comments, but if we're doing this fairly informal, I have a request or something. I don't know. I just let the board members know something from the Assembly's perspective from being a one-year member. If you go back to the previous slide, had to do with that directly. So your proposed budget on the 1st, recommended budget on April the 1st. So this happened to us the last year, and it caused frustration for a number of the Assembly members where, let's just suppose, I'm just going to make some numbers up, and they're not real, but let's suppose you had $10 million in savings and you asked for $40 million. I know these aren't real, from the borough. You know, from my viewpoint anyway, it'd make a lot of sense where you could say, well, up to $5 million of that $10 million or whatever could be contingency. So if the borough doesn't come through, your budget's going to be good. Because the alternative to that is when you come to the Assembly and ask for money, it kind of sounds like you're saying you must give us all this money or else teachers are going to get pink slips. And it doesn't seem like that's a good budgeting practice to me. So anyway, that's my perspective when there's sufficient savings. If there weren't savings, it's a completely different story, you know. Makes sense.
So we'll take that into consideration, and Mr. Andy, you can continue.
So the three main revenue sources being state, local, and federal, and we'll go through each one of those. Kind of a pie chart of those different revenue sources. The green being the state revenue, roughly 64% of our revenue. The local contribution being roughly a quarter. And then federal, most of that's impact aid, not all of it, but most. And then a small portion, that's our fund revenues budgeted out of our reserves, our fund balance. We'll go through the state foundation funding formula. We'll go through that. The main driving force behind our state revenue is what's called ADM, or average daily membership. That's basically enrolled students within the school district. Kind of a current year revenue is based on what's called a 20-day count in the month of October. And we've just finalized that count. It's a 20-day count. You take the average of all 20 days and you submit that number to the state. And that's what actually sets the revenue for the current year. It's kind of an interesting scenario where that number, the 20-day count number, is due on November 9th. On November 5th, today, is due the projection, our forward-looking projection for next year's enrollment, which will set the baseline for our revenue estimates for next year. So it's kind of an interesting week where we're sending projections to the state that will set the baseline for next year's revenue. We're also, in that same week, sending them our actual count, which sets current year revenue, which is right now we're about 370 students down from our projections. So that'll equate out to about a $3.2 million loss in the current year. So the point being with this slide that our revenues from the state are set in large part due to enrolled students. This is a...
Ms. Like, I'm sorry, Andy.
Is that 370 down from last year's projection like a year ago?
Correct. So, yeah, a year ago, exactly. A year ago, November 9th, we sent a projection for this school year, the 18-19 school year, and we're 370 down from that. Correct.
Ms. Sanford, okay.
How much is it down from the actual number from last year at this time? Not the projection.
Good question.
Hold on one second. Mr. Dorn, hold on a second. She's going to look it up real quick. Okay, but go ahead, Mr. Dorn.
Okay. I just think the clarification is that the number of students that we based our budget on for this year, we are 370 students below that. So it was the number we actually used for this year's projections.
Yeah, but her question is how many from last year?
And perhaps I don't understand how you guys come up with your projections, but I'm trying to figure out if, do we project large to, we can maybe get into that later, I guess.
Do you have a slide on that, Andy?
Not on enrollment projections, no.
Okay.
I know
Miss Leah Berman? I'm sorry, Miss Williams.
So I'm still confused. Numbers that you just counted in October determine how much money you are getting in the current fiscal year from the state?
Correct.
And budget that you're already budgeting on.
Correct.
Spending.
Correct.
That's statewide.
State statute.
State statute. Yes, Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. I guess following on that, maybe you can explain what happens when you have a reduction in ADM to the projection. And so you mentioned it's $3.2 million that you're going to have to adjust your budget. Is that money that you have to send back to the state, or is that money that, how does that work, the $3.2 million adjustment?
Yeah, that $3.2 million is adjusted by the state through lower revenue payments in the second half of the school year. So from about, it either begins in January or February, those revenue payments will be adjusted downward.
If I may, the important piece for the school district is perhaps in the private sector you'd be considering layoffs, but we can't do that because we have annual contract obligations, so we don't lay off teachers or other staff as a result of that. So we carry our expenditures through and then have to use fund balance to make those adjustments.
But we don't get any additional funding also when we get students that come in every year after the 20th. We don't get additional funding for those either, but we still have to teach them. Yes, Mr. Majeski.
When there's changes to enrollment numbers, which I assume is basically about every year, especially when there's significant changes, do you usually have a good idea of knowing if that's a change because people are having bigger families, smaller families, there's more people in the borough, there's a preference for homeschooling, private schools, or, you know, those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a good...
One of the, you can go after me because you have more information, but one of the things that we came upon this year, Fort Wainwright, we knew for sure we were going to have a certain amount of kids at Fort Wainwright. We were down 100.
Actually, between the two schools, we're probably down closer to 175, just Fort Wainwright military, Army-connected students alone. And the challenge with that is the military's not sure why either.
So that wasn't very predictable then?
No.
It's not. We have a hard time with the military. It's just a hard number to get your hands on. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Andy, can you just add on a little bit? Or is that sufficient for you, Mr. Lejeski?
That was going to be my answer.
I mean, that's sufficient. I wasn't, looking for, I don't think there's a perfect answer to it.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Just want to make sure you had your answer.
An illustration of that is we've had work sessions, and behind the scenes we're working on the impact of the district with the F-35 bed down, and even oftentimes military personnel are having a hard time predicting growth there. And so I think it's all of the above, the different areas that you mentioned: homeschool, demographics, just the demographics of military personnel coming into the area. They're working with formulas applied to large numbers, and for one reason or another, if those demographics don't play out, you can see variations in the expected student counts that we expect to see. So just to answer the question here from Ms. Stanford, last year's ADM was 13,703. And this year, that number was 13,270. So a significant drop.
Yes, ma'am, Ms. Sanders.
So your projection was less than what your ADM was?
Correct. Yeah, we predicted a decrease. So last
But
year's.
you just didn't predict the whole decrease?
Correct.
Gotcha.
It was much
Gotcha.
larger.
Okay.
Yep.
And everybody has been doing really well speaking into the mics. I just want to remind people, bring the mic close so that she's doing recording from the mics.
So this is a.
I'm sorry, Ms. Williams.
One more question. Just so I'm clear, when did your fiscal year start?
July 1.
July 1.
Correct.
So you're budgeting starting July 1, and then they give you less money if your enrollment goes down based on counts in October for that fiscal year.
Correct. So we're attempting to predict the enrollment now for the budget year that's going to start in 7 or 8 months, for a school year that will start in 9 or 10 months, correct?
Mr. Lejeski.
I'm just curious. I don't know if you've got records of this, but what's the biggest difference been from the prediction to what actually happened in, I don't know, the last 10 years or something?
This is one of the largest. I could look up the graph from the last work session. I think maybe 241 or in that range was 2014. There was a significant dip.
What's that translate to into dollars for the budget?
So 360 is what our current number is 3.2 million. So that must have been maybe about 2.2.
Okay.
But Ms. Like,
is that number just the state money? That doesn't
state contribution.
Does that affect the federal impact aid at all? Your count?
There will likely be an adjustment, but we won't see the impact of that adjustment for a few years because those payments don't come till later.
And certainly, sorry.
Oh, no, you can go ahead and answer, Andy. You're excluded.
Just want to make sure. Certainly, as other folks have mentioned, we're seeing a lot of the reduction in our on-base schools, military-connected schools, and so we do expect, whether it's this current year or the next, for impact aid payments to reflect those decreases.
Mr. Lejeski.
I got a question about the timing of the cash flow. So when do you normally see the dollars from the state? And when would you see the reduction that you were, versus what you were expecting?
Yeah, so we'll see the reduction in January or February. That will start. We don't quite receive payments from the state on a monthly basis, but it's close. I believe there's 8 or 9 annual payments. So we will begin to see the reduction in their expected payments based on our projections. We'll see those reductions in the second half of the school year.
Okay, so if you expect X amount of students and they're starting to pay, you said it's not monthly, it's like, is it on a schedule or is it somewhat random actually?
It is on a schedule. I'm not 100% familiar with it, but
okay,
it's almost monthly.
So you would get payments for what was predicted for the first half of the fiscal year. And then it's the second half of the fiscal year that gets negatively impacted if the prediction was wrong and the enrollment turned out to be less?
Correct. We're receiving regular revenue payments right now based on the projection. We'll send in that actual count at the end of this week, and then the first payment that will be impacted will be somewhere in the January-February range.
The reason why I'm asking is I'm trying to work out in my head if there was a really bad reduction and there wasn't enough money that the school district had to cover it, if there'd be enough time for an ordinance to be written to come to the borough and ask for money to fill in the gap. And it sounds like the answer is yes, but I'm not entirely sure.
I believe there would be.
I think there would be time. We can always take on more money. Okay.
So this is a overview. The next couple of slides are an illustration of the state foundation formula. And this first slide is an illustration of what's called taking our average daily membership to what's called an adjusted average daily membership. So we identify our ADM right here, and then the state multiplies that ADM figure by a number of different cost factors. And I'm going to go through each one of those cost factors here in a moment. And then this is the second half that ADM adjustment generates a basic need entitlement, and then there's a formula from there. But before I get into this, I'm going to go through these different cost factors. The first cost factor, so this right here, this was our projected ADM for the current year. Actually, no, for last year. So this is the current year projection, ADM. It's actually minus our correspondence students. So this is the starting point. And each school is plugged into a formula. Small schools receive a higher adjustment than large schools do. Most large schools, Lathrop, West Valley, the adjusted ADM comes out basically the same as their actual. However, small schools such as Salcha or Two Rivers see more of a significant increase. You can see district-wide, there's roughly a 2,100 student increase for the school size adjustment. The next step is the district cost factor. So we then take the school adjusted ADM, apply it to a cost factor. Anchorage School District is 1.0, and every district in the state has it's a regional cost of living adjustment, and Fairbanks is 1.07. Apply that and get 16,538.
Mayor Ward?
How is that calculated? You said cost of living, is that based on?
It would, and I haven't been here long enough to get into the details of that, but I'm sure they take a regional cost factor, factoring in housing is always going to be the biggest, utilities, your basic staples, food, energy costs, etc. But it would be probably an entity within the state that identifies the different costs of living geographically and applies those to the different districts.
And it's been in place for such a long time that over time realities have shifted, so we've actually lobbied pretty heavily at times to get the Fairbanks cost factor adjusted, because Kenai has actually allocated more funds for, in theory, a higher cost of living, which we argue against based on fuel costs and other things. So there's some disparities and discrepancies and arguments around the state about what that should be. So,
have they developed a methodology to it, or is it just?
There is a methodology that was developed. There's often when you hear it in the news, it's called opening up the formula. There's conversation about opening up the formula, but there's actually quite a bit of reticence because the concern is there's going to be winners and losers in that, and how if the pie gets sliced differently. Fairbanks could come out ahead. Fairbanks could come out in a worse situation than they are. So there, not a lot of agreement. There's agreement that the foundation formula needs to be adjusted. There's not agreement about when or how. So, yeah.
That's typically a polarizing topic within the school districts of a state because oftentimes it creates winners and losers. That's why it becomes so difficult. So. The next multiplier is the special needs factor, and this takes the ADM and multiplies it by a factor of 1.2 to go to 19,845. The next factor is the career and technical funding, CTE factor, and there we're adding 1.5%, arrive at 2143. And this is a big one. The district's intensive count for special ed education students. Intensive count students are identified within the district, and those students are multiplied. That number is multiplied by 13. It comes up with a whole number that is added. So we have the 20,143. Last year we were roughly in the 415 range, multiplied by 13. And it's roughly 5,400 is added to the 2143 to come up with 25,538.
Mayor Bryce?
I'm going to take a step back. The CTE funding, the educational factor for that, it's 1.015. Is that uniform across the state, or is that, again, regional?
That's uniform across the state. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't see your name. I'm sorry. You Mr. Tacky, right? Mr. Tacky.
My question, it was the same one right before that, actually. If that was also the same across the the state, or if there's based on a number of special needs.
It is uniform across the state, yes. And then the last one is here. The first ADM number did not have correspondence students, and here we're adding in the correspondence students that were left out at the beginning. We're adding back in our correspondence students to come up with a total adjusted average daily membership of 25,804. So roughly speaking, you just shy of double your actual student count for the purposes of the state foundation model. Then we take the 25,804, and that number is multiplied by the BSA, the base student allocation. That's a widely published number at the state level. It's currently at $5,930. Typically, when the legislature is debating education funding, that's the number that oftentimes they're debating on whether to increase that number or decrease that number.
I have questions from Ms. Williams and then Mr. Doran.
The correspondence students, what does that include?
Those are our correspondence students enrolled in Fairbanks Best, the Fairbanks Best program.
Does it also include homeschool students that?
We have homeschool students that are part of that program, but just the Fairbanks, just the ones in our particular program. So not in Raven, not in IDA, just our district.
Just Best.
Just Best.
Perfect.
Yep.
Mr. Dorn?
And just to clarify, the correspondence students do not get those other factors worked in there, just a straight number. Is that correct?
Correct.
Even though they might get some special education support, they...
Correct. Correct.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper.
No
too
problem.
close.
I was going to ask about charter schools and how they calculate or factor into the ADM.
So they're actually counted as just a regular student, and then there's a formula that we use to then allocate funds to the charter schools, and we just give them, mostly based on their student population, we just give them their money, and then they do with that as they like in terms of staffing, how they want to, some of them have custodians, some don't. Most don't have nurses, most don't have counselors. Most of them invest their funds into teachers for the most part. Yeah.
Mr. Tacky, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's actually right along that line. It's in regard to the charter schools. I'm assuming that a school size factor would, does that take into consideration for the adjustments at the state?
How about the charters with the school size factor? Yeah.
Are you asking if the school size factor that we saw applies to?
Yes, exactly. Utilizing that same as the charter schools, smaller class size. So
yeah, I was going to mention that the funding model that we utilize for the charter schools is basically a mini state model. It mirrors the state model that we're going over for the school district, and we utilize nearly that same model to set the funding for a charter school.
Excellent, thanks.
So we take
Mr. Lejeski, sorry.
I'm just curious, when the numbers come off different than predicted, does that meaningfully change the cost structure for that year? I'm thinking the answer is no, because like you said, contract's already there. Maybe some classes get a little bigger or a little smaller than anticipated, but what's the real answer? Like, let's say you get 500 more students for the year than you expected. How significantly does that impact the cost structure?
So we do end up hiring more teachers in that case, so more teachers than originally anticipated and other staff if needed, because we have target class sizes that we still try to meet. Yeah.
So the answer is if it goes up enough, it could add more staff and therefore cost. But if it goes down, everyone who's hired, it's not like they get laid off. They keep their job.
Correct.
So it's kind of like a one-way. Okay.
So we take the adjusted average daily membership, 25,804, multiply that by the 5,930, and that creates what's called the basic need entitlement from the state. And this was the prior slide that I illustrated, and this
the final phase of this formula is we take the basic need entitlement, we subtract out the required local contribution. We'll go over that here in a minute. And that's at the borough level. They subtract the required local contribution, and then they deduct out what's called deductible impact aid. So there's a formula, and it's actually based on the local contribution that subtracts out. It usually ends up being roughly right around half of the impact aid. So that's kind of an interesting twist to impact aid, is that districts that receive impact aid are deducted roughly half of that from the state foundation formula. So, and then we come up with the $115,212,000. Of note, that $115 million current year, that does not include TERS and PERS on behalf payments, which are roughly in the $12 million range. And this question has been asked a couple times. It also doesn't include our portion of the $20 million one-time appropriation that the state made in the last legislature. And our portion, again, was about $2 million of that. So.
The award? I'm going to go back and forth on your name, okay?
That's all right. You knew me as Bryce. So the required local contributions deducted from the base allocation for school districts for schools that are not within a municipality, that number, there's nothing to take out because there is no local contribution, correct?
That's a good question.
Somewhat loaded,
correct.
I know.
No, it's correct. Yeah, correct? So municipality districts rely solely on the state allocation. Not too many of them actually have impact aid outside of the urban areas.
For the federal impact aid.
Correct.
So they wouldn't receive that. That's the deduction. So, but for the required local contribution, is that statutory?
That is, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That required
the
local.
minimum? Yeah, that part.
2.65 mils is what that required local equals.
I'll hold my comments.
And so total state aid in our budget book for the current year is shown at right around $130 million when you include in the TERS and PERS on behalf, as well as our portion of the one-time $20 million appropriation from the state. That's state. Any other questions on the state foundation formula?
I see a lot of really frown faces when we were discussing how we get our money. It is very complicated, believe me. And over these years, it still gets complicated for me. Mr. Cooper.
I don't want to get bogged down in the details, but it might be worth a short discussion of how the PERS, TERS on behalf payments work and what those are, because not everybody might not know what that is.
Yeah, I don't have in-depth knowledge of that in my time yet. What I do know, however, is that simply has to do with catching up the state retirement system. And I don't know. Again, I don't know a lot of the details.
It's not
of
a number
that,
that we determine. The state determines it. They give it to us, we book it, and then they take it away. So it's an in and an out.
It's basically a state pass-through that you have to book.
Pass-through that we have to book, yeah.
Under GASB 47 or something like that.
Yep.
Dominique.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Ms. Bradley. And it's Ms. Brady? Okay, I'm sorry. I keep calling you Ms. Bradley. I'm sorry. Mr. Doran, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I just saw her hand up. So okay.
Okay, I guess we can move on.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, that number was a huge number that I saw in the historical charts.
That huge number was related to the infusion. Those of you who have been in the state for a while, there was a $2 billion infusion from the state into the TRS system and a $1 billion infusion into the public employees retirement system.
So to revenue local, slide here that illustrates the local contribution. Column on the left just illustrates, again, the required local contribution here. That's 2.65 mils of the assessed borough valuation, which is somewhere in the $11.2 billion range. And then the additional allowable right here is an additional $35 million. And that's described, this slide's a little bit difficult to follow, but it's described over here. The additional allowable is determined by either 2 additional mills right here, either 2 additional mills on the assessed valuation, or 23% of the current year basic need from the state. So if you take that $153 million, multiply it by 23%, and it's whichever is greater of those two. So either 2 mills or 23% of the state basic need, whichever is greater is the additional. And in our case, it's the 23% of the basic need. So additional 2 mills is that $30 million, and then the 23% is $35 million. So that creates a total the maximum contribution would be $65 million. And this column on the right, the middle column, illustrates where local funding currently is at. So we have the required local at 30, and then the additional approved is this 20 right here. And then the red at the top is the additional that would be allowable under statute.
Mrs. Sanderson.
So the red is, you're saying that's additional allowable, but actually you can only have one or the other, right? The greater of the two.
No, the total allowable is this entire area right here. So it's that $35 million right there. 23%. The borough isn't required to allocate that full amount. This is the approved contribution additional that the borough approved. This would be additional allowable under statute that the borough could approve.
Got it.
Mr. Lejeski and then Mr. Tacky.
I hope someone in this room knows, but I'm wondering if this is fundamentally different than how most other states operate, or if we're kind of in line with what they're doing, or what.
I have no idea. How about you, Ms. Brady?
I think there's much that's fundamentally different about Alaska, but having worked in other states, Mr. DeGraw could probably.
I know better than to say what goes on in other states, because nobody cares what goes on in other states, because we're in Alaska. There are different ways of doing this, and it is done in other ways in other states.
One thing that's really important to remember is in most other states, school districts have bonding authority and have the ability to raise revenue, which is a significant difference. So, they raise their own revenue for capital projects is the most frequent. You probably have other examples, but yeah. And then forward funding and just the formula in general, and also the very interesting pieces about rural Alaska and urban Alaska that are so unique in terms of how funding works in this state that even those costs, even that whole foundation formula is just so unique to Alaska. Yeah.
Mr. Tacky?
I just wanted an explanation for the percentages that are in this particular.
Yeah, so the required local is 46% of the maximum, and then the additional local that the borough has approved is 77% of the maximum allowed. Okay, sorry, I forgot that.
Mr. Gray?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Pointing out that goes with the second column.
Yeah, these percentages right here go with this column right here. Yep. And then the last portion, federal revenue, most of it is impact aid, a little bit of ROTC in there, and a couple other items, but 95+% is impact aid. General overview of impact aid, it's somewhat complex and difficult to put a finger on oftentimes. The general idea is that it's there to replace lost property tax revenue, so an area where there's significant federal lands. The two most common scenarios are Indian reservations or military bases, some form of federal land. The formula that's used to generate the numbers specifically centered around identifying federally connected students. So in our case, those are students enrolled in the school district that the lion's share of the revenue is who live on base. They're much smaller dollar amounts come by way of military students who live off base. The lion's share of that is students who live on base. Instead of enrollment, Impact Aid uses average daily attendance, so they're actually tracking daily attendance instead of enrollment. And then there's a student-weighted system that's utilized. There's students with disabilities against where they live, whether they're on base or off base, are big factors there. And then generally speaking, the revenue, the timing that we receive the revenue is very unpredictable. And then the amounts are also unpredictable as well. The main reason why the amounts, one of the big reasons, is it's generated mainly off of average daily attendance. And then just again to the conversation we had a little bit earlier about trying to project enrollment, if those projections are difficult to pinpoint based on what we're seeing as far as military transfers, it makes this number quite variable in nature. To jump to expenditures, so that kind of wraps up the revenue conversation. Just before we move on, just wanted to give a brief outline of our budgeted expenditures going through the budget process. This column right here identifies our costs budgeted by what's called function, so instruction being the largest, special ed and student support services, and then administration and so on, operations and maintenance. So this is by what's called function. 46% of our budget is instruction, the largest portion. And then along the bottom, it's general fund by expenditure type. So salaries and benefits being the largest portion at 87%, and then contracted services, materials, equipment, and other. Usually the big item there is transfers to other funds. So now we'll talk a little bit about fund balance. Again, I appreciate this opportunity to be able to talk about this topic. It's something that, again, I'm very new to the school district, but not necessarily a topic that I'm new to. I do have significant experience in this area in the other districts that I've been at, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, my job is to come in to Fairbanks and to not go off necessarily my past experiences or philosophies, but find out what works for our organizations here in Fairbanks and bridge those gaps, open those lines of communication, and be able to facilitate that process to where both organizations can work well and move forward in lockstep. Just a couple of the highlights of fund balance and the philosophy, and the Board of Education has taken some steps towards establishing the direction of the school district. The main idea is to protect against revenue decline. Another point that's important to note is that generally it's part of a long-term plan. Typically don't accumulate fund balance or deplete fund balance in a quick 1 or 2 year period. It's typically 3, 4, 5 year period of time where that occurs. And then bullet point C, I think, is kind of the key point for the school district. Is the idea is to maintain educational services. We certainly will see booms and drops in funding. We live in a cyclical economy, obviously based for the most part on natural resources, and so the nature of that economy is going to generate boom and bust scenarios. And so the purpose of the district being to maintain as much as it can the educational services to provide a quality education through those downturns. The revenue outlook that we're looking at, and this goes to when we're talking fund balance, I want to talk why a fund balance, and then also how. I think it's important to talk to the points of how we've gotten to where we're at today. And so this goes a lot to the why. For all intents and purposes, we don't expect to see any significant increase in revenue in the next 2 to 3 years. Certainly, we can hope, we can be optimistic, and we're seeing signs at the state level that things have bottomed out, and that's always the first sign to a rebound. You have to see a bottoming out of the economy. We're hopeful that that's occurring right now, but we don't necessarily expect to see any material increases in revenue in the next 2 to 3 years. For the school district, and B and C kind of go together, they go in lockstep. A static revenue environment, so if it stays level, that typically equates out to a cut for the school district. As does the borough, we operate in a collective bargaining environment where we have negotiated agreements that create automatic increases in salaries and benefits for staff. And so basically static revenue is a cut in a sense. Reduced enrollment, that can come into play more on an annual basis. We've talked about that. That certainly is in play this year. We hope to turn that around next year to be more on with our projections. A new charter school coming on in 2020, that the revenue of our new charters based on enrollment, the charter Discovery Peak in North Pole, its estimated revenue from the district will be about $2.1 million, but most of that will come from staffing that will be absorbed from other schools within the district. So it won't necessarily be an additional $2.1 million cost to the district. There will be some minor costs due to running an additional facility. That would be where the district cost would be. But staffing being the major cost will be absorbed by other schools for the most part. This is our 4-year plan for our fund balance drawdown. I think this will be, for me, this is an important dialogue to have. I think there's been some confusion or miscommunication on whether or not this plan exists, and I'm here tonight to say that this plan does exist. We do have a 4-year plan, and that plan, that drawdown has started right now, is occurring as we speak. I'm going to go through, these are, I mistakenly left in federal there, the second line, but aside from federal, these are the 5 funds that we're honed in on. So general fund, transportation, food services, equipment, replacement. So you might see an acronym ERISF, and that's the Equipment Replacement Internal Service Fund, and then risk management. And I'd like to go through each one of these funds and explain the nuts and bolts kind of how those different funds are scheduled to have their fund balances drawn down in the next 2 to 3 years. You can see the bottom line here, and it's important to note also 2018, so this is the fiscal year that ended June 30, and these officially are estimates at this point. So this number is an estimate. I don't think we expect that number to materially change when our financial statements are finalized, but that's going to be a general ballpark, and officially it's an estimate at this point. And then 2019 is the year that we're currently in right here. And I'm going to jump into the nuts and bolts of each of the fund categories. Any questions to this point?
Sorry, she had to leave. And so whose hand went up first? Okay, how about Ms. Williams?
Yeah. Just a quick clarifying question. The numbers in the draft that we received a week ago are significantly different from the numbers that you're projecting.
They should be in what we've adjusted since the draft is this number right here. So we have a little bit more up-to-date risk management fund numbers, and I'm going to go through in detail how that fund works, and hopefully that explains to your question.
Thank you.
And others? Mr. Lachewski?
So you might, if you're going to get to this anyway, feel free to skip it.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of curious, and maybe part of it anyway, kind of high level. So none of these are technically designated funds, I'm going to assume, because that's kind of tough to do under the Constitution. If that's the case, then this is just what I'm thinking off the names. Some of them must have intended purposes, even if that's not what they legally must be used for. Does that sound right, or is that wrong, or?
I'm trying to understand your question.
Well, so for example, transportation, $4 million in there. There's no rule or requirement that says all of that money must eventually be used for transportation.
The money received from the state specifically for transportation expenses needs to be spent on transportation, yes, but there have been additional transfers in to help subsidize that fund from general fund because it has been traditionally ran into a deficit due to our new contract with First Student.
So that $4 million may have different colors of money, in other words, sitting in it.
But we plan on using up that fund balance because First Student's contract has been running us in a deficit.
Okay, is that generally true for all of them, that they could have different colors of money?
Food
that
service.
makes this all really complicated.
So food service receives, kids pay for lunches, and then they also receive grant money, and then general fund also helps subsidize that fund as well because it traditionally runs in a deficit every year as well.
I think I just need to listen for now. Thank you.
Was there any other? No? Okay.
Thank you, Jay. Mr. Dorn.
Andy, maybe just going back to Ms. Berman-Williams' question in terms of in the draft, I believe you had the local and student activities monies in the draft, and because those have been excluded from that conversation, so the student activities monies and the local were taken off, so that's why you'll see some of the difference on the bottom there.
Thank you, Mr. Dorn. Yes, that's a great point, Ms. Williams. We probably in my draft had 2 or 3 funds that were also amended out of the ordinance at the last assembly meeting. So that would have been an additional change. And then also there's different risk management numbers that you're probably noticing. And I'll go through and explain the nuts and bolts here in the coming slides. So yes, some differences. So the transportation, nutrition service, and equipment replacement funds, those funds are all subsidized by the general fund. So as Ms. Herbert just talked about, these funds basically, in large part, go up or down based on the activity going on within the fund, and then to a large degree, the size of the transfer from the general fund. So all 3 of these funds are subsidized by the general fund. If more dollars go in, the balance goes up. If that transfer goes down, they're naturally drawn down. So, for example, our transportation costs were funded at approximately $12 million by the state, and our annual contract plus fuel costs for the district are right around $15 million. So naturally, each year there's a $3 million deficit running that fund would run, and so to keep it level, there would be an annual $3 million transfer.
Sorry.
So I'm assuming the practice then is if you had some extra money from the previous year that was colorless money, if we want to call it that, right? It could be used for anything. And you get some new money, and you're going to spend the most restricted dollars first to keep all the options open, right?
You could say that, yes.
Is that what actually happens?
General fund money is typically the first dollars that are spent, in my experience. Now,
Ms. Brady.
The audited financial statements for your flow assumption.
Can you pull your mic up a little bit, please?
The audited financial statements, which have your flow assumption published and is audited says you spend your most restricted first
Okay.
in your footnotes.
I can follow up.
Yes.
Okay, so if that's true, then my conclusion is for like that particular fund, since it's annually being subsidized, then all the dollars sitting in it now, at least like historic, that are kind of rolling over, if you will, should be general fund dollars, and therefore the school district can use them however it wants to. It wouldn't be restricted to transportation. I don't just want to make sure I'm interpreting these correctly.
Yes, they're currently assigned because the board has designated that fund for transportation costs. So the transfers that general fund has made into it, it's gone in there specifically to help subsidize transportation. But the board could make a motion to once again transfer those funds back out for a different purpose.
Yeah.
The Nutrition Services Fund operates in the same way. That budget is right around $6 million annually, and typically there's between $400,000 and $600,000 deficit annually, and so it receives subsidies from the general fund as well. The equipment replacement.
Mr. Cooper has a question.
Yeah, and sorry to jump back, Andy. I want to go back to the transportation fund real quick and just ask. I mean, this may be the how question: is how did that we get to the $4 million balance in 2018? I apologize if I missed that, but I was curious how that amount ended up there when you're looking at a target of 82,595.
I believe most of that had to do with liquidated assets. No, that's not the term. Liquidated damages.
And so just to add on, that was money that the district received in settlement from First Student because of the busing issues that it had.
Some of that, yes. Yep.
Then the last fund, the equipment replacement fund, that's a fund that has been established to facilitate the district in its replacement of larger cost equipment. The fund was established for the purpose specifically of systematically replacing devices for students and teachers. And so that we typically have devices on anywhere from 4 to 6 year cycle. And so to facilitate the replacement process of those devices, that was the reason why the district established this fund. Additional purposes or possible uses for the fund in the future would involve equipment, food service equipment, so high cost refrigeration and freezer equipment, also capital equipment in our facilities and maintenance department. Those are areas that the district has let lag behind in recent years, and ideally would utilize that fund to systematically replace that equipment and put it on a replacement cycle that the district can follow.
Well, I know we're supposed to go until 7:30. Is there any portion, I know we still have a half an hour, but there seems to be long conversation. So we can go until 8. I'm not stopping us from going later, but I kind of want to know if there was a certain area that you would like to have more information on now, or we can continue on with Mr. DeGraw giving us the explanations.
I think we keep going. That's my opinion.
Keep going? Okay. All right, Mr. DeGraw, continue.
The next fund I want to talk about is the Risk Management Fund, and I from what I hear, this was a fund of particular interest over the last year or so, and so I'd just like to talk about how the fund functions in relation to the general fund, and then talk about some of the changes that have been made in this area internally within the district. The methodology of the fund, the Risk Management Fund, is it generates its revenue directly from the general fund, and the way that it does that is by applying a benefit rate. So each year, the school district sets what's called a benefit rate that it applies to every dollar of salary that the district pays out. So, for example, if the benefit rate is set at 30%, each dollar that's paid out, 30 cents goes into the risk management fund directly from the general fund. And from the resources that are funded through the general, that's where claims, health insurance claims, are paid out. Okay, so in essence, it's a pass-through fund used to generate revenue from the general fund and then pay out claims as they occur. One significant change that's occurred within the district just in the last 2 to 3 years. The district, at one point, the district identified that it was running, for no other better term, inefficient health insurance plans. Historically, about, I would say, 15 to 20 years ago, the health insurance industry began to see significant increases in premiums for health insurance due to increased costs in the healthcare industry. And the way that organizations, municipalities, governments confronted those increasing premium costs was to move to more efficient plans, health insurance plans. The basic factor that you're looking at is in bullet point B, it's rate times cost. So when you look at, and I like to use the car analogy, the cost would equal what a price of a gallon of gas costs. So $3.40, whatever it is, that's the cost. The rate is how fuel efficient your car is, whether you're driving a 1977 Oldsmobile or you're driving a 2018 Honda Civic or a Prius, Toyota Prius. Okay, how fast are you burning through the fuel that you're putting into your car? So the district found in its investigation 2 to 3 years ago that we were utilizing health insurance plans that were acting like a 1977 Oldsmobile. They were burning gas, high utilization rates, and health insurance industry costs are increasing, as we all know. So high utilization, high cost. So it was really we were burning through millions of dollars each year is the short of it. So the district made the strategic move to move towards high deductible health HSA plans and HRA, or health reimbursement account plans. And what those do is those basically encourage a lower utilization rate. They're more efficient. And the net effect was they saved the school district millions of dollars. So we see a sharp increase. Okay. So we saw, I'm going to jump here to this slide. And this is an illustration of what occurred in the risk management fund. You can see, if you look at total actual expenses here, 16, right there, 35 million. And this is about a 7 or 8 year look back. Every once in a while, we saw either a flat year or a slight drop. But if you look back 10 to 15 years, the average increase for the school district was right around 6%. So 6% increase in health costs. And in 17, the new plans were instituted right in here. We actually saw a $3 million decrease, or $2.5 million decrease there. And then if you look at projected costs, this is what, if we had made no changes at all, these would have been our projected costs right here in FY17, FY18, and then FY19. That's the current year that we're in. Conservatively speaking, the district has saved roughly $10 million in the last 2 years. And if you include the current year, we could easily save another $3 to $4 million based on those more efficient health plans that we've put into place. I feel that a large portion of our overall increase in fund balance is due to these changes that we've made in our health insurance plan, and just being more efficient with the way we're applying our health insurance benefits.
Is the school district self-insured?
Yes.
And can you describe how the premiums have changed for employees?
Yes, we are self-insured. When the new plan structures were put into place, there's currently a Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. The district, the HSA plans right here, the HSA and the HRA plans, those are Plans B and C, and the district covers 100% of the cost of those plans. And the reason why the district does that is to encourage migration towards those plans, because they do save the district, and in the end, they save employees significant amounts of dollars. Plan A premiums are set by our actuary, and they are set off of 12-month projections. So they take 12 months to look back. They use that to project forward 12 months. And they are increased based on the expected claims for the next 12 months.
Go ahead, follow up, Ms. Williams.
Can you describe how deductibles have changed in the plan change also, roughly?
Yeah, deductibles, I know in Plan A, deductibles increased. I think historically, if you look back, this is before my time, but I think deductibles were around a couple $100, a $200 deductible at one point. And I believe in Plan A now the deductible is $1,000. Don't quote me on this. Somebody could maybe look that up. I believe they went to $1,000. Maximum out-of-pocket costs also would have increased somewhat. If you're to compare total costs of Plan A, B, and C, Plans B and C are actually less costly to employees than Plan A. And that's mainly due to the fact that their employees are paying monthly premiums to participate in Plan A, and those are the Plans B and C are at zero cost to the employee. And I can get that detailed information for you, Ms. Williams, was it? I'm sorry. Yeah, I can get that information for you.
Mr. Tackey?
My question is on FY17 on the next slide. In regards to implementing your example of, like, we bought a Prius, but then we start budgeting like we have a Suburban. And so we start, the health insurance rate went from 30 to 32.7%. So, I mean, like, I'm kind of curious how that came about.
Yep, and that's a great question. That would have been due to, in large part, to not being able to necessarily predict what the net benefit was going to become. I know the district was very pleased, surprised on the good side on how much the savings was that was generated. I think it was expected to be around $3 million, and it turned out to be nearly $5 million in the first year. If you see from FY17 to 18, you see a 1% decrease, and then in the current year, we've decreased almost by 3% that benefit rate. So it's kind of a lagging benefit. So an initial spike in the balance of the risk management fund, and then it's going to be a slow, well, I don't know about slow, but it's going to be a gradual drawdown because we're reducing the benefit rate. So fewer dollars.
Right, are going into the general fund.
Going back in.
Or going into the risk.
Yeah, fewer. And claims, while they initially dropped, will begin to start going back up. And so that will naturally draw this fund balance in the risk management fund down. So we're estimating, again, between $35 and $40 million flows through this fund on an annual basis. It's somewhat difficult to predict what's actually going to happen. We're setting that benefit rate here in the next couple of months for kind of the same conversation as the revenue we were talking about. We're setting that benefit rate in the next couple of months to predict claims up to almost a year and a half from now. So we're doing our best. I know the Borough, the Risk Committee, there's been conversations on working on how we can get some good information to be able to try to better predict what's going to happen in that fund. But yeah, I'm answering your question, but.
Well, yeah, no, I understand. I was just curious that an actuary wouldn't have caught that. If, like, you guys get your benefit rate then based off your actuary as expected utilization of these different health plans?
Again,
are you asking about the FY17 projection versus actual results, Sean? Mr. Tacky?
Yes. Ms. Herbert. Well, I'm asking about the insurance, like your benefit rate that you're actually funding it. So every dollar, like you said, you take 30 extra cents to put into the risk management fund to pay for claims. Who determines the 30% or the 32% or the 31.7?
That would come out of work combined between the accounting office and my office. And it would be based on anticipated claims for the next year to the best that we can gather that information.
Exactly.
That far out.
But you mentioned you having an actuary.
But for FY17, it wasn't in a negotiated agreement that we had to have the actuary project costs. And so when we budgeted for FY17, that was still based off of a 3-year historical average look back. And it wasn't until FY18 and FY19 that our contract required us to get the actuarial to project what our costs would be for the next fiscal year.
Thanks.
Mr. Cooper's next, and then Mayor Ward.
Thanks. Well, that line of questions set up perfectly for my questions. Thank you, Mr. Tack. And so my first question was answered, which is when and how do you set the benefit rate? And then the second question is it possible to adjust the benefit rate more frequently, say on a quarterly basis, so that the district can respond to trends that it's seeing in claims coming through the risk management account or risk management fund? Or a theoretical question. I'm just wondering, like, if it sounds like it's set on an annual basis now, and if there's a potential that it could be adjusted to be more responsive going forward.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in theory, we can adjust that benefit rate. Realistically, fundamentally, how that would play out when the rubber hits the road might be a little bit more difficult, but I believe there are adjustments that we can make to that fund if needed.
Thanks.
Mayor Ward.
Questions for Ms. Brady. The same broker that we have that manages the borough's health care fund also manages the school districts? Is that correct?
I think you might be talking about the healthcare consultant, health benefit
yes, I'm
consultant.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it's the same firm that we both use. She goes to the school district and works with their health benefits committee. She comes to the borough and works with our health benefits committee, and she does projections of healthcare, what the healthcare costs are going to be in the budgeting, the year that you're budgeting for both entities.
So it sounds like the methodology that's used, or at least it's...
I presume she uses a similar methodology for the school district. For the borough, she does 3 different types of methodologies to come up with a range of per employee per month cost in the future budget year. And then they look at those and they typically choose something towards the middle of those 3 methodologies. They historically, for us at least, they've been fairly close, the different methodologies that she applies to get those projections. They're overlapping ranges.
Sounds like the methodology that's used between the school district and the borough is different, and there could be some benefit to working a little bit closer together on that methodology to nail that number down.
I'm not sure what is done for the school district. I know she does work with them and meets regularly with their committee.
And I believe there's a piece of that that's negotiated as well. So we actually just changed that formula. So, yeah.
And
with the last round of negotiations,
I believe ours is negotiated as well, correct?
Yes.
So, sounds like we could work together and maybe bring some efficiency there.
That's something else we could look into. Mr. Quest.
So, given that the the risk management fund is a pass-through fund for the most part. Can you help me understand why it has such a large balance recently? And I know that there have been some savings, and that's part of it. But it's a pass-through. Like it seems like you, in the future, you're happy to have it have a relatively low balance, and historically it has a relatively low balance. And one of the reasons I ask is because there's a perception or misperception, and you can help clarify maybe, that that the school district is maintaining a large balance in this fund in order to be able to have less money lapse, essentially.
Sure. Yeah.
Explain that a little bit to me, please.
Yeah, I think from the history that I've been able to gather in the short time that I've been here, I don't necessarily feel like that was looked at as a place to put dollars, to protect those dollars. I think it was simply based on those significant savings that occurred. Another note to point out, from the 30% to the 32.7% increase, at the time that 32.7% increase was decided upon, it wasn't necessarily known internally with the district if those plans were going to be instituted. So I really do think that this increase in the benefit rate plus the savings of the more efficient plans was the lion's share of that spike. It spiked from, I believe it was right around $700,000 up to almost $8 million, $7.9 million, I think, in 1 year. And that obviously is a large increase. My eyebrows would be raised as well.
I'm going to follow up on that. So is that increase coming from is that increase coming from a single appropriation, or is that increase just coming from the formula?
It would have been over time, yes. It would have been over time. So fewer dollars going in here, or I'm sorry, more dollars going in. So increase the rate by 2.7%. Every percent is roughly $1.5 million each percent. So more dollars going in, not necessarily knowing if the plans were going to be instituted. Then the plans were instituted, and claims on the back end started dropping. So more money going in, dollars going out, decreasing, and that would have happened over a period of time.
I just have one more brief one.
Mr.
So that benefit
Williams.
money, which is coming from the general fund, is assigned, right. But is it restricted in the same way that, when you have money from different sources, it's restricted? We were talking about transportation earlier.
Sure.
I would say some of it is, because it's not just general fund that pays the benefit rate. Transportation has salaries. Food service also pays salaries. Employees who work on grants, those salaries also pay into the Risk Management Internal Service Fund. And so you'd really have to analyze where the money came from what source, of whether or not you'd be willing to transfer it back out. If a grant paid into the Risk Management Internal Service Fund for employee benefits, you've told that grant program that was what that expense was for. And so you'd have to analyze it, which is why we reduced the benefit rate in the subsequent year to relieve those funds the next year and reduce that fund balance in Risk Management Internal Service Fund.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Williams, go ahead.
So you've got a fairly aggressive drawdown rate on this risk management fund on your spreadsheet. Could you tell me a little more about what the effect on employees would be? I mean, how you're going to implement this drawdown if the risk management fund is what you're using to pay out healthcare claims?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the level of the fund, I think, certainly is up for debate, and one of those talking points where I think that I would want to come to agreement on what we all were comfortable with. I illustrated this drawdown. This current year is based on what we expect to happen, and then in the subsequent drawdowns in 20 and 21 are simply a static $1.5 million drawdown. Nothing necessarily formulaic to that, just an estimated drawdown. We would have to set a benefit rate to accomplish that on what we estimated it would take to accomplish that. And then the net effect of that would be increased pressure on the general fund, and then at some point I would anticipate that plans B and C would no longer be able to be offered at no cost to employees. I would expect that probably somewhere either here or here, but that's certainly speculation at this point.
Yeah, Bryce.
So one of the confusions with the risk management is it sounds like it operates primarily like a healthcare fund, which is some of the terminology that I'm possibly used to. What else is included in risk management that's not healthcare related, and then what component of that is it? 10%, 5%?
Other components of that fund would be property and casualty insurance, I believe, and Ms. Brady might be able to jump in here. Workers' compensation. Those are probably the big ones. Those are property and casualty, liability, and workers' comp are big categories.
Ms. Brady?
I'm not sure if property. I think you might pay your property out of your general fund
Out of our
and not
general.
out of the risk management fund. But I believe the workers' comp, auto liability, general liability, errors and omissions, public officials, I believe are in this fund, but I can't remember for sure.
We include our property in the risk management internal service fund as well. Okay. And I don't know what percentages those make up of the thing, but obviously health costs is the biggest portion, being 30 million plus of it, and the others combined don't make up even $1 million.
Yes, Ms. Brady.
There is a component in your general fund. Is that the excess insurance premiums? Is that what you pay out of general fund?
I'd have to.
Okay. There is a component in general fund that pays some piece of the risk management. I just don't recall what the details are.
I'm gonna look into that. I'll look into that, and then your question as well, Mayor. Get you information on that.
Okay, are we moving forward now? Okay.
Again, just to wrap up this topic, this range right here is estimated cost savings. I would stress that those cost savings are perpetual. Basically, instituting the new plan design that reset the baseline, so to speak, caused a decrease in premiums over a couple of costs over a couple of year period of time to, again, set the baseline in a sense and create savings that will be ongoing. And I'll get into this in my final comments, but I consider myself a tax hawk, so to speak. I'm extremely fiscally conservative, excuse me. And this is literally an issue where the district has become more efficient in spending healthcare dollars, and we will in the future be able to reroute those dollars, not leaving them on the table, but reroute them to better be able to serve kids and provide a higher quality of education for our students in our school district. Last couple of slides, these provide the highlights too. And again, you guys might be able to, folks might be able to separate out this slide. I apologize. But I'm going to go through the nuts and bolts of this right here in these next couple of slides. The general fund, we estimate that in the spreadsheet to drop by $5.3 million. These estimates were created back in March, April time frame, and since then, that budgeted amount in the general fund has been set at $6.5 million. So our intention is to hold the line the best we can to the $5.3 million level. The transportation, nutrition services, and equipment replacement funds are slated to decrease by $2 million. That's a cumulative number for the three funds combined.
Mr. Cooper has a question.
I was just wondering if you could explain a little more the difference between the $6.5 million that's budgeted and the $5.3 million that I think you said was projected on the drawdown in the general fund. And then a second question that you can address, and maybe you will later, is how you're going to deal with the $3.2 million reduction from in-state funding from the change in average daily attendance.
Yeah, I will say, Mr. Cooper, that difference between the 5.3 and the 6.5, I simply didn't want to change the drawdown amount from the projections to the higher number. So didn't want to change the numbers, but obviously I changed the numbers on the risk management fund, so didn't necessarily stay consistent with that. But nothing more than just didn't want to increase the drawdown of the general fund balance. That now to your second point. There will be significantly more pressure on the general fund this year because of that decrease, and so it's possible that we could drift more towards the $6.5 million level. And then continuing on, the risk management, again, as I referenced earlier, our latest figures indicate approximately $4.1 million drawdown of the risk management fund balance, again, based on benefit rate expected claims. In 2020, we have set, again, the general fund decreasing by $5.4 million. There will be additional pressure potentially by way of increased salaries and benefits in fiscal year 20. We're not necessarily sure what those numbers will be as we're going into negotiations in the January-February timeline with the three separate unions. But just to give you a benchmark, each percent of salary increase to the district is roughly $3 to $3.5 million in increased costs, and that's assuming steps and grade advancements for certified staff as well as classified. And then the scheduled decreases in those next three funds in B is $2.4 million. And then the risk management fund, and again, that's a static number that we've just have estimated at this point, that the benefit rate would be set based on expected claims to drop by $1.5 million.
On my mic. I'm used to the mics always being on, so I have to remember to hit the button. Andy, you may not know the question, so this may be more to the administration. Is this 4-year plan written down anywhere? Is it adopted as a policy or any kind of formal document that says this is like the strategic plan that we're going to take?
No, I think it's just been a working document that we've, that we worked with the board last spring. And certainly as we, again, sort of look toward legislative session and possible funding and tomorrow's election, really trying to, again, project static and depending on the election, potentially significantly decreased state revenue. So it's just been a working document for the board. The one thing that is in policy is the board's target fund balance. So the 10% is the maximum in the state, and the board has a policy to keep a 6 to 8% just in the general. So that's the only hard number that's in policy.
Okay, thanks.
And then transitioning into the proposed ordinance, and again, these are estimated numbers, although they became much clearer after the amendment that was passed by the Assembly. I believe it was Mr. Cooper's amendment to cap the lapse amount at $7 million. And that's illustrated here at the bottom. This number here again is the total fund balance for the 5 funds that are in consideration.
I would just like to say Ms. Majors has joined us, so you can put that on the record. Go ahead.
the amended ordinance would cap the lapse at 7 million. And this, I kind of, once I adjusted an existing spreadsheet kind of backwards here. So this number, this top line number minus the capped lapse amount equals the amount that would be allowed under the proposed ordinance. Any questions on that? Just want to make sure that's clear. Again, this was also
Mr. Cooper? Sorry.
Just want to help clarify, looking at the chart under allowed per ordinance. Of course, we have the first line is the 18% of the FY18 appropriation, and then where you have numbers for general fund, subsequent years, transportation fund, food service fund, activity, and local fund balances. That's the amount that you've assigned for FY19 out of those funds. Is that right?
Correct. And this initially, this spreadsheet was set up before Mr. Cooper's amendment. So this was going to be a cumulative list of what the school district understood the impact of the ordinance to be, so to speak. So these numbers added up to roughly it was actually 17 million and change. And so our understanding at that point was the 33 minus these numbers, which equaled 17, we're going to equal roughly a lapse amount of roughly in the neighborhood of $15.5 to $16 million. So, but that changed. We capped that lapse amount there and created a new. And these numbers, because I changed that last minute, do not add up. But the cap of $7 million created this amount to be rolled over.
I was just pointing out for two reasons. One was that it shows, I think, one, your interpretation of how the ordinance would work, and two, just demonstrates that you have assigned funds in your FY19 budget, showing that you're using money out of general fund, transportation, and food service. So I wanted to kind of unpack that chart a little bit.
Sure. Moving to, this is my last chart. And this chart illustrates how we would see the impact of the ordinance, basically comparing the 4-year drawdown plan as it stands now, pre-ordinance, and then if the ordinance were to be passed, as it stands currently, how that would affect the bottom line. Again, if there is a lapse that's created by the ordinance, really there's be 100 ways that we could take from whichever fund we identified, and so I just took a simple streamlined approach of zeroing out transportation, food service, and equipment replacement, leaving the risk management fund to be drawn down as it stands based on the current benefit rate, and then to adjust the top line general fund accordingly to create that number there, the 26 million, and then applying the same drawdown rate that is in the prior spreadsheet, applying that same rate of drawdown, create a $14 million bottom line at the end of the current year. So again, remembering this is current year, the current year that we're in right now. And then at the end of next year, assuming that same drawdown rate, roughly a $5 million cumulative fund balance. And that number, if we look back historically, that number would be somewhat low compared to historic. I'm seeing roughly the last 10 years of fund balance. It would be a little bit on the low side.
Mr. Tackey?
Just from going from 19 to 20, I think that, like, per the ordinance, it's set that there would be like a $9 million general fund permission, so that we wouldn't need to actually drop that low, and then you would be just a little bit less than what it was historically, rather than 6 or 7.
That is true. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. So good point. A lot of numbers flying around in a short amount of time. So Mr. Tackey's point is well taken. This would be roughly 9 million the ordinance would allow. Thank you.
Ms. Williams, and then Mr. Lejeski and Mr. Doran.
Based on what you were describing earlier, it seemed like the abrupt increase in the risk management fund was due to lots of employees changing their health care plans. I guess I wonder why you would zero out transportation, food service, and equipment, which it seems like you've described you need to keep some fund balance there in order to maintain the full risk management balance. More of a philosophical question than a numbers question.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand your question.
It looks to me like to meet the borough's take in the proposed ordinance, you're taking all the money out of transportation, food service, and equipment. Is that inaccurate?
That is accurate.
That is accurate.
Yes.
I guess I'm wondering why, as opposed to taking some from risk management, which has more money in it than it might need to carry, given that it accumulated that money due to changes in the healthcare plans.
And I'll answer the best I can and defer to Ms. Herbert if there's any technical accounting details to add in. But there's a number, in my limited accounting knowledge and expertise, there's a number of ways that we could draw down that fund balance if there was a lapse from the proposed ordinance. And so I zeroed those out. And Ms. Herbert can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any requirement to carry fund balance in the transportation and food service funds. For several years in the past, we've actually run deficits in those funds, and so I'm not necessarily aware of a requirement to keep fund balance in those funds. Going back to, as far as my understanding is concerned, there's many different ways we could draw those funds down. I just took that simple approach.
This is just a simplification of the numbers. This is not necessarily, this is just to get to a simple bottom line.
Right.
Next, Mr. Lejeski.
I'd like to ask a question of, in particular, Mayor, all the school board members, and all the assembly members, if I could, and just kind of like a lightning round poll. I don't know if you want to conduct it, but so the question would be, do you think that the school district should routinely help with maintenance of buildings financially? And so the way I'm going to define it is the two ways of helping that I can think of, and I'm sure there's more, would be a budget line item. I don't even know if that's legal. I haven't talked to the attorney about it. But a budget line item of X amount of dollars annually just kind of goes into it. Or lapsing, where the lapsing tends to happen pretty consistently and routinely, maybe varying amounts, but it would normally happen. So for me, the answer is yes, but I'm just really curious just what other people think.
So I'd like to answer that. The district is very interested in being a part of a conversation about how we how we take care of maintaining our buildings. The lapse, this is lapse version number 3, I think I've operated under since I started. The first one was quite draconian, and then we went to the $800,000 cap, correct, and we continually asked that the Assembly waive that. I think a lapse approach is faulty, and it doesn't work well for us, and especially in the intensity of the politics at the end in the spring. But I would prefer a methodology by which, where we determine, we have a very solid 6-year project outline in terms of what buildings need to be taken care of, what those specific projects are. We're familiar with roofs that were recently on the bond proposal. Our two entities, specifically the two facilities departments, work together, work on what those projects will be over time, have a 5-year timeline, and then plan appropriately for that. And then I would prefer a forward funding approach. And again, I don't know if that's a line item in the budget. I don't know if that's exactly what that looks like. The challenge is the discipline in the moment in the spring, right? To say, okay, so we're going to plan for 2 roofs, 1 roof, whatever, next year. That means $3 million. So we want to, here's the local contribution. in theory, or, either on top of it or as a part of it, however that parses out, $3 million of that is going to be placed into that reserve maintenance fund for use on roofs. Again, that requires discipline on both parts to make sure that money drops in there. A lapse ordinance is problematic for us, and this kind of ordinance, again, we want to be sure that those funds are used for school projects, and I think we recognize, I feel like I speak for the board, we recognize and we don't want our buildings falling apart, and so we would rather have a forward-looking plan with amounts that are allocated each year to do that. So that's going to take some time, I think, to put together, and again, I think our facilities department probably could have it done in about an hour, right? I mean, between the two of them, it's very easy for them to come up with this. I think it gets challenging just when the political pieces of that, get involved. But I think, I've talked with the mayor about looking at that kind of approach and trying to move forward with that method.
You need to talk to the mic.
Yeah. So just from that perspective, I would just like to ask, so you mentioned that you have a 6-year plan, so how do you determine right now what facilities need repair, what the priorities are, your 1 to N list, whatever that might be? Do you use any software, or is that purely just what your facilities folks are telling you?
Sure, that's what the experts who work for us are telling us. But to be fair, Mr. Sloan and Mr. Norum are constantly talking about, projects and what needs to be done and sort of where those priorities are. When you're talking about what goes on a bond, then there's other things that come into play, like let's make sure we have something on this end of the borough and something on this end of the borough, and all these other things come into play that aren't necessarily just about facilities. But when you just look at what needs to happen with facilities, we have a 20-year plan, and again, that's a bit too far out of a projection, but what's the lifetime of a roof, and where are we at with our roofs, and which projects need to be ticked off. I mean, it's not. I don't know. It's been very consistent since I've been here, because I've been in multiple meetings where we've come together and talked about these projects and said, here's what needs to be done, and when the funding becomes available, here's the top 3, here's the top 4, here's the top 5. And then, of course, we are submitting capital projects to the state as well all the time, because, they have metrics that they use. In fact, we just got our list back today with the scoring. So, and if capital money begins to flow, we at least know where we're at in the list. They could still go around us like they do sometimes. But
Mr. Dorn was to be next after Mr. Lejeski, so I'm inserting Mr. Dorn back in, and then I'll get to Mr. Quest.
Okay, I can wait if we want to finish this particular, because I want to go back to these fund balances.
Okay, well, Mr. Quest had a question.
Yeah, so on this topic here, of the, and this is for Dr. Borough or any Board of Education member who might want to weigh in on it, but of the tens of millions of unrestricted dollars that the district has now, and not unassigned, unrestricted, I think we all hopefully know the difference now. How many of those dollars either, and you can give me a ballpark or a percentage, do you think should be used for school district building maintenance?
Current year.
Yeah, of the current fund, unrestricted fund balance. And I mean, I could speculate as to what your answer is, but I'd like to hear it.
No, I think, so I don't want to speak for the board, because I think there's some conversation there, but I think the way to approach that, again, is for the two administrations to get together and look at that and, determine what projects should we be bidding on for the next construction season. Is it 1 roof? Is it 2? What's the actual cost, right? And then is there a way to get at that this year, and and then looking forward in coming years. So again, I don't want to speak for the board in terms of what kind of decisions they might make around that, but
I could ask the question in a different way. Is the number larger than 0?
So you're asking me if I feel like we should allocate any of these funds to the repair of roofs in this fiscal year, and I would say as superintendent, I am open to that conversation. Yes. Again, I can't speak for the board on the final decision on what they might, what decision they might make based on my recommendation after conversation with borough administration.
Thank you.
I would agree with that as well. I think the board needs to have a conversation before we just say an amount, and then the administration would have to hold fast to it. Mayor Bryce was next, and then Mr. Chackey.
So I just want to echo what Dr. Dvorak is saying, and I'm committed as the administration to continue to have those conversations on how we can work to put a plan forward to take care of these buildings that our students are in, and I think we can do that constructively. Continue to work towards putting that plan in place. And I'm excited. I think this is the start of that conversation. It's the start of how we can look to the future and really be able to plan a little bit more in advance. Some of the discussion I've heard in the past on the lapse ordinance is that's a methodology to deal with maintenance. It's not the only methodology. But with that being said, I'm very interested in continuing the conversation on how we can work to put a plan forward so we don't have that frustration that seems like comes up every year, especially talking with the lapse ordinance.
And
I wanted to touch on what he was saying.
Okay.
So just to add a little bit more to your, and, you know, if you can, Mr. Norm, correct me if I'm wrong, but the maintenance that we can do on a building is only up to $25,000. This is borough building, so anything over that, we have to come to the borough and ask for permission to be able to do anything with that. So, you know, speaking as a board member, you know, I can only go, we could do 25,000 before we come to you guys and go, can we do more?
Next I have Mr. Tackey was next.
Actually, yeah, along those lines exactly, actually, is that all these buildings are in the borough's possession, and so to actually do capital maintenance, it has to come from the Fairbanks North Star Borough, and not the school district whose monies that are allocated to you have to be used for the operations of operating the school. So to actually do those major maintenance projects that need to be done, they come out of our backstop fund. So to have them come back to be able to be utilized would be a necessity.
And again, I guess I would just very respectfully suggest that there might be a better way of looking at it than just you know, we only can spend $25,000. Again, we've been, the way we've been trying to get at those funds is on the back end. I think we can plan ahead and get at those funds on the front end. Anyway.
And then I have Mr. Dorn was next.
And I think on this, it's a good question, because what is the purpose of the various perspectives? So we have a problem with maintenance of buildings, and Borough's done a lot of work on explaining that to the community. We have a concern, we have a common interest in that, and so I think working it out. The difficulty with the lapse as such is the intent of our receiving money is to use it for students, not to lapse it. And if we're dependent on, if we're building the solution for building maintenance on the idea that we're going to have X amount of money at the end, you're kind of going at cross purposes of why we're trying to use the money most effectively for kids. Not, you know, but we have to solve the problem of the building maintenance. And so I think really, I'm glad to hear both administrations talking about that, because it's really getting down to what the problem is, or a problem that we're trying to solve, which is building maintenance and how we can do that, address that together, and yet not being dependent, because you could have X amount on a lapse one year and no lapse, and then maybe another different X amount, and so you never know where you are with that, and so it's not really solving that issue.
Questions? Mr. Lejeski.
So then this is kind of another open-ended question, but, and I know the state has limits, but do board members in general think it's okay to have limits on how much money can be saved?
Anybody else want to speak? I can speak to it.
Well, it's in state statute that we are limited.
But outside of that, additional limits.
I think we have to kind of put it in perspective. I mean, I could say off the cuff it would be okay, but we really have to look at our funding. We're talking about risk management. We're talking about school funding. We can't just say just off the whim that, yeah, it would be a good idea. There are a lot of things we have to look at, and there are a lot of things we need to sit down and talk with the borough about before we would just jump into something like that. Have more questions, Mr. Lajewski? It's supposed to be a round robin of questions that you had, so I just want to make sure we cover them.
I think I got one more, but I got to think for a second to remember what it was.
Andy, are you basically finished with your presentation, or?
You can just wrap it up, my final slide.
Okay.
I would, since the amendment, Mr. Cooper's amendment, I would adjust these dates to 2021, be an adjustment to that. I guess I would just like to communicate to the Assembly that the drawdown of our fund balance has begun. That actually is going on. For administration's part, for my part, I mentioned it earlier, I'm very much a fiscal conservative. I consider myself a tax hawk, and I will say this from my perspective that I feel that the dollars that the school district receives are sacred dollars. Those are taxpayer dollars. They're my dollars. They're all of our dollars around this table. And I pledge to utilize those dollars as efficiently as possible and as best that I can as far as my recommendations can go as an administrator. Ultimately, the Board of Education makes those decisions, but I feel that the fund balance that the school district has accumulated will help deliver the quality of education that the school district intends to provide through the lean years that are upcoming in the next 2 to 3 years, 4 years. That's my pledge, is to treat those dollars as sacred and to utilize them as wisely as we can. I think that's, in the end, all of our common goal as we try to move forward as two organizations moving forward together. That's my approach to our fund balance and to the drawdown of that fund balance.
Dr. Gabor?
Thank you.
Well, again, I think when you look at the four-year drawdown plan, I mean, what's important to us is when you talk about what's actually going to happen with these dollars. In transportation, we know, again, we're subsidizing to the tune of almost $3 million a year, so that money is going to be used for transportation. Food services, the only reason there's a balance in there because it was a recommendation of the auditor to move money there and take care of the deficit, right? We typically carry a deficit in that and have for years. The auditor said transfer funds, so we transferred funds. So it doesn't feel quite right that that should be perceived as a negative. The equipment replacement fund, we have over 16,000 devices in this district. We are going to carry, this was by design, we are going to carry significant funds and spend significant funds. We've already got $1 million going out the door. In fact, we already put in the order. Not to get us to a one-to-one ratio with devices, and then also to be on a 4-year replacement cycle with student and teacher devices. And we've only just begun with this because, again, we have not begun to save funds. I think we explained last spring that the average age of our fleet, of our facilities fleet, is like 12 years old. I mean, we are going to need to be starting to replace some of our trucks. We need to, I think, purchase another bulldozer. We've got significant capital purchases to make. So there's going to be money moving through that fund. And then the risk management fund, as we continue to get better and better information about our claims, then the benefit rate that we will set will be that much more accurate, and that will balance out. And then we had this great conversation the other day about, what percentage you hit, what any organization, what target in terms of that benefit rate is, and then you keep that, right, at a pretty reasonable level in terms of then being able to adjust if those claims come in higher than anticipated. So again, when I look at this, so if these areas get zeroed out, or however you want to parse it, again, your money will be taken away that has some very intentional purposes moving forward. All that to be said, I'm not saying that in this fiscal year we can't have a conversation about what projects should we be looking at for this summer. But I would just like some time to have that conversation, and then moving forward. So,
Mr. Dorn, and then Ms. Majors. And Mr. Cooper.
Andy, could you go to the next to the last slide? Yeah, right there. Just a clarification, I have two questions about this. I believe a comment was made in terms of 2020. The ordinance would allow us to have up to about $9 million based on this year's local contribution. But we don't get there because from FY18 to FY19, we have used about $12 million roughly for this year's budget.
Yep.
And with this projection, we're going to be taking at least about $9 million from those funds to fund next year, which means we're already at a loss of $3 million. We've already made a certain cut for the carryover. Do I read that correctly? So that we don't have $9 million at the end of 2020 by
Correct.
any?
Yeah. In response to Mr. Tacky's comment, he is very accurate in that we are allowed to hold $9 million here. However, I think the point that you're making is assuming no significant increase in revenue, we feel this is a realistic scenario based on our anticipated cost increases, again, assuming that static revenue. Another thing to note that I didn't build into the cake necessarily here at the last minute was there would probably potentially be an additional lapse here based on the current ordinance as it stands. Again, if that maximum was 18% of the local contribution, there could be roughly a $5 million lapse here as well, which would bring that down to 9 right there. So I think there's several different scenarios that could play out. But just to follow up on Dr. Gaborik's comments, we feel that this 4-year plan that we've outlined, there are several mechanisms in place there that are nothing's a sure thing in life, obviously, but the board has made calculated, systematic moves, budget decisions in 19 to create sure decreases in those different fund balances. So we feel like this is a realistic and a very likely scenario. Obviously, you can't pinpoint exact dollar amounts and what's going to play out. But.
Okay, so my second part of that question was that when we go from 2019 to 2020, this is actually reflects an adjustment to the 4-year plan because our best, and again, not using as much from the fund balances for next year as we've been able to use this year, we're already below the 2021 4-year plan amount.
Correct.
So this is the 4-year plan is one that we kind of keep as somewhat ideal, not perfect, but in mind as a goal, but this has already adjusted that significantly.
Correct.
Next, I have Ms. Majors.
I have two questions. The first one, Dr. Gabor, you had mentioned, just as an example, right, from the equipment fund, 16,000 devices that would need replacement. So I guess the question that I have, because this is sometimes confusing to me, is how much of those devices were initially, and I understand you probably wouldn't have the exact figures, but do you have a percentage of how many of those devices were provided for in grants, and do grants not then cover, or do you not anticipate grants being available for replacement of those devices?
The Department of Defense grants have provided some devices for military connected students. A replacement is not a part of the current grants. The one that we just recently received is much more about student services, staff support services than it is about devices, so not as significant. And then overall, we're looking at the district in terms of getting rid of our vintage devices and replacing those. So some of it's the purchase of replacement of vintage devices, and then also getting the entire system up to a 1-to-1 ratio. So we certainly use grant funds where available. And again, if once we get to the place where we feel like we have all students at the level of devices that they need to be, and then we're coming up on our 4-year cycle for teachers, so we have another lease to build in terms of that. Once we feel like that system is set, then we're going to start looking at other equipment needs. So,
well, I'd like to add before I let you go, Andy. We started at a foundation of nothing as far as computer replacement goes. So once we got into a fund where we could build forward, this made it accessible so that teachers don't have to deal with these computers that don't work at the time when you really need them. So this plan is a ultimate plan that we really needed.
So I guess my question would be, do you actually need a fund for that, or is that a line item in your budget, right? That doesn't have to be a fund, but then you're actually anticipating life cycle costs as part of your budget every year, so you're managing that replacement. And I guess that's just a question that I have, whether or not an actual fund would be necessary.
So we haven't been. We've been leaving that up to schools, and it's been very hit and miss with huge inequities across the district. So we have taken that over to level the playing field, to leverage purchasing power, and to also make sure that that device distribution is equitable and is not about whose PTA can raise more money, or how, again, a building principal may or may not, under political pressure from their own building, may or may not be able to allocate funds to devices or to other things. And so we've never had, we've been working on this even before I got in this position. How do we sustain not only our devices, but we have significant infrastructure costs. I mean, we have wireless access points in every single classroom. So again, all of that needs maintenance and sustainability. We haven't even wrapped our head around some of those pieces yet. So I could have Janet Cobb, really go into the details if you're interested in looking at those numbers with you.
And I guess I would go back to, does that require a dedicated fund, or is that an item in the overall school district's budget that accounts for those costs year by year, this dedicated reserve fund?
Again, there's different ways of getting at that. We've decided to look, to dedicate a fund to that. So.
Okay, and I just have one more question, if that's okay. And so then on the summary slide, right, it says that the ordinance impact would necessitate significant cuts in 2020. And so my only other question to that would be, do you not see an opportunity through the budget process working with the borough as a means to perhaps reduce the impact of any of those cuts?
Yeah, I would say yes, certainly there would be an opportunity. I feel fundamentally that the existence of the fund balance, while there might be a sentiment that there was an over-allocation on the front end of the cycle, that this would reduce any school district asks of the borough in the absence of that fund balance, if that makes sense. So fund balance existing compared to no fund balance, I think that fundamentally reduces that ask. To what degree, I obviously wouldn't be able to predict that, but certainly, again, would even out just as the school district is trying to deliver a level educational product. It would certainly, I think, have a leveling impact on the ask of the borough from the school district. To your two other questions, is this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To the grant question, Ms. Major, as Dr. Gaborik mentioned, we do have the opportunity with certain programmatic grants, DODEA grants, to purchase devices. The main funding that we receive, our consolidated grant funding, requires us or prohibits us from supplanting, so to speak. So we're prohibited from purchasing devices for general education purposes with those federal dollars. We're allowed to supplement, not supplant, so to speak. And then just to your question and your points about the utilization of the equipment replacement fund, the vision that the district has for that fund, branching out into the capital equipment, starting with the technology devices and expanding out into the capital equipment area. And as Dr. Gaborik mentioned, we have let that equipment age. We haven't replaced a truck or a van in 6 years in the school district.
Lost your voice.
And at some point.
Down there.
Hello? Hello?
I think mine's down too.
Check.
Hello?
It timed out?
Hello? This one's out too.
What?
I think mine's still. Oh, none of ours are working.
Yeah, it's
It timed out.
I just talk loud. Do I just talk loud or stop?
No, she's got it recorded, so you got to kind of yell
Talk
so she
loud.
can hear it.
Okay.
I can speak for you if you like. Send me your thoughts.
Playground voice.
Just as we look to expand out.
You got to yell louder than that, Andy. I'm sorry. I can't hear you down here.
To expand the utilization of that fund into the capital equipment arena, certainly could we just
Everybody can take a break.
Oh, there it is.
There we are. Back on. Okay. Well, we'll just take a break anyway.
Just
5-minute break, guys. Can we bring everybody back to the table so we can get started again so we can get you home?
I appreciate it. I'll be
Mr. Production over there.
Down with that.
Well, Mr. Andy, did you want to start back again, or did you want us to go on to the next question?
My report is complete.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. DeGraw. Next, I have Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. And I guess I have kind of two observations, comments, and I'm sorry, as I've been listening to folks, some of these may be related to things from a little bit ago, but one, talking about budgeting for maintenance. I think I've made this observation to several folks in this room that a few years ago, the University of Alaska Board of Regents started budgeting for maintenance in its operating budget for major capital maintenance. Not every capital project can make it in there, but they took that step of saying this is something that we have to do on an annual basis up front. And I recognize there's a difference in situation between the university and the Borough School District relationship, and Mr. Tackey's right that maintenance obligation falls on us, but certainly it's something we could consider, budgeting for as part of the school district's budget, as part of their annual request, and just saying this portion is for maintenance and this portion is for operations, and we'll put the maintenance portion in the district FMR account right away. So I think there are ways to address that prospectively within the structure that we have, and actually I think it makes good sense to consider budgeting for maintenance up front, just as a general proposition. The second observation, I guess, is, we talked a lot about this 4-year plan, and I asked a question of the superintendent earlier, is there something written down? And I think from my perspective, after observing this and dealing with this issue for a few years now, I'd really like to see some formal 4-year plan in policy, adopted by the administration or the board, or something that Mayor Ward and Dr. Gaborik agree on, that they can say, we've got a yardstick that we can measure progress against. Because I think part of the problem we have now is that we don't have kind of a tangible way to measure the 4-year plan. And I want to offer a little bit of, I guess, historical framework to underscore this. And I apologize because we'll necessarily be oversimplified, because there's a lot of nuance to the history here, right, that you can't really capture in 100 words or less. So earlier on in the evening, Dr. Gaborik mentioned that we've had this lapse ordinance in place for a number of years, and there was a very draconian version, and then there was a version that capped the lapse at $800,000. The district came back and asked to waive that, and then we, on at least 2 occasions, and then we, as the Assembly, changed the lapse ordinance again to make it to put more, I guess, discretion on the part of the district about how that works. So it went from draconian to more of a, you guys do this and calculate it and tell us what we get back. And at that same time, I think it was FY16 and 17, you have to correct, I don't have all of my sheets in front of me, but we saw pretty significant increases in the general fund balance during those 2 years to get to the general fund balance that the district has now. So it has this steep arc going up over, at the time those ordinances are releasing the borough's controls on the lapse, right? And at the same time you see the risk management fund growing, and you see the transportation fund growing. So from the borough perspective, we see this upward arc of fund balance, and we don't see it going down. And I think that brings it back, having a plan that we can say, so it's not just the school district saying we're going to spend it down, but we have a plan that's adopted, that's approved, that we can measure that against, I think would go a long way towards helping solve this issue. Because I think that the plans that Andy has laid out make a lot of sense. We see them on paper. It says this is how we're going to get down to these numbers, but having something that we can measure success against, I think would be important. So.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And I believe my next person is Ms. Williams.
One of the concerns I heard from Mr. Doran a few minutes ago is that while the school district budget is sort of set out on July 1, the actual amount of money that the district gets is not known until significantly later, due to the time that the state counts the kids and how much money it gives you. When do you feel like you have a better sense of when the budget is fairly stable?
The district begins to get an idea of our current year enrollment. In the first 10 days, we do an activity internally similar to the 20-day count. So we start to get an idea late August.
But the numbers that we've looked at, and all the numbers that you were doing the budgeting off of, where you were saying, well, this is the effect of the proposed lapse ordinance on these numbers, they reflect the July 1 budget, or they reflect the budget after it's been adjusted because you know the state contribution?
It would be, the lapse ordinance comes into play at the end of the year, so it would be the adjusted number based on real enrollment numbers.
Follow up, Ms. Williams? Okay. Next person is Mr. Tackey.
I think Mr. DeGraw and Mr. Doran already explained the fact that much of the fund balance is already being utilized in the budget, and so taking from that would be pretty devastating, right? So the budgeting process for 2019 even was hinted at. But I just want to mention that the fund balance that was already been assigned to the budget for FY19 is not included in the ordinance's adjustment, calculations. I just want to clarify that.
Next I have is Mr. Quest.
So I have a comment, or maybe it'll end up in a question, but so I see the current lapse code, at least the spirit of it being that the unrestricted monies that the district have should be calculated as part of the lapse. But the way that it's written, it's unassigned, and as a result, the school district can assign balances or assign funds to different balances, and then they no longer become part of this lapse calculation. And kind of in a similar way to Ms. Major's question earlier about, do you need a fund for this, or can it just be a line item? Well, if the monies aren't restricted, that's really an academic distinction. You can put it in a fund, or you can put it in a line item, and they're internal restrictions. They're not money's not actually restricted. So so without kind of blabbing on too much more, what I see the ordinance 2018-41 as attempting to rectify is to bring the spirit of the current code in alignment with the letter of the law, so that when things are truly unrestricted, that they get calculated in the lapse, and it removes some. This is a poor analogy, but there's something of a shell game that you can play with funds, and it removes that ability. And it seems to me that that's an appropriate path to be going down. And I guess I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's an important part of the conversation that at 8:30 we haven't even gotten to start on. And so I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Trying to insinuate I'm running a long business.
So I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the poor metaphor. I guess all I was trying to say is that you can, put things in a different place, anyways, that you get the idea. I wasn't trying to imply any.
I didn't take it. That was a joke. Okay. Mayor Ward is next.
Well, I think there is some. I got this on here. So I think there is some philosophical difference of view on lapse, and there's plenty of us here at the table. I'm sure we all have a little bit of a different idea on that. I think really in the context of what we're looking at, there's the state's statute, which says I think 10% of the budgeted for that year is what the cap is limited at. I understand that there's some history and that there's some challenges with the Assembly in how the lapse ordinance has been implemented on the school district, and how ultimately that's been dealt with. And so one of the things that I have coming into this, I think, with somewhat of a fresh perspective as a concern is, I'm a big fan of fiscal stability and planning. And so when I look at an organization that's trying to put together a plan on how they can be responsible and take into account consideration for future costs, future expenditures, I think that's a good thing. And I think that's something that we should expect from our school district, we should expect from our borough, from our cities, from any of our elected bodies, is that people are planning for the future. So I commend the school district on that effort. I do think that there is some concern, though, on how much that can build. I think that is something that needs to be dealt with through trust, whether it be through meetings like this, continued meetings with the school district and the Assembly. I think we can get there. Putting back with that fiscal responsibility, one of the things that I do see, and it's kind of been touted as the plan, is this four-year spend down plan. I don't necessarily know if I view that as a good thing. So, there is concern about how much fund balance the school district should have. And I realize we're looking at a small component of the fund balance and how much we're using of the fund balance. Really, we haven't had any conversation on revenues or expenditures. Those are very big components to a budget. So, I guess when I look at this, I do have concern with a spend down plan that doesn't take those things into consideration. I think we can look at those at a year-to-year basis, but I'm not necessarily excited about that idea of spending down that fund balance either. So looking at the different mechanisms, healthcare funds, I think that there's some things that the borough has to offer to the school district as far as how we can look at planning, how we can better equip the school district through some of these processes, whether it be a lapse ordinance or not a lapse ordinance. But I see just a tremendous field of opportunity here for us to be able to work together better to help with the fiscal stability that's needed from the school district, and then also for the tax jurisdiction, the borough, to be able to justify to our taxpayers on how we're going to deal with these issues. So I just want to leave that caveat out there that that spend down plan, although it's kind of touted as the plan of how we're going to deal with this fund balance, I don't know if I'm necessarily excited with that plan either. So I do look forward to continuing conversations with the administration and the school board, and I think this is the beginning of a great new relationship that we're going to have. So,
and I would like to just say that this relationship doesn't start with it starts with today, but we can't wait 6 months before we meet again. We have to make it, I would say, once a quarter or once every couple of months, because the collaboration that we've done here tonight would go away if we wait too long. We have to keep it ongoing. We can't stay till midnight like you all are used to. We leave at 10 o'clock, okay? But we're not staying till 10 tonight, I hope. But I just feel that what Mayor Ward is speaking of, I think that's a great observation. It's something that was put in place, I want to say about a year ago, the 4-year plan. I think it was about a year ago when we put that in place. And the same thing with the equipment fund. I think it's a great idea with an equipment fund, and the reason being is because I've been around for 12 years, 13 years this year, and I've seen the equipment that we've had to have our teachers work with, our students work with, and we have a lot of low-income students that can't afford a computer, possibly. The equipment fund would make them accessible to it. If we can get it to a point where we have a one-to-one plan, it would be great. There have been a lot of ideas, a lot of information that was put out here tonight, and I just feel like this is the starting point, and we can only go forward. Yes, Ms. Anderson.
So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Gabor and Mayor Bryce, and to the Borough Assembly members that are sitting around here in our school board. When you are involved with these kind of leadership, these kinds of things that we've been tasked to do, it's always going to be difficult. It's never going to be easy. But I so appreciate the insight and the perspective and the questions that have been presented here today. And the thing about numbers is I have to wrap my head around the numbers, so that's why I'm not having a whole bunch to say about numbers. I come from a totally different perspective. And I do appreciate Ms. Williams, and she kept bringing it back to the impact on our members and the students that we serve in this district. And that's one of the perspectives I bring. I understand about the lapse fund and how the impact. I've been in buildings and seen buildings that, need the upkeep, need the repair. But I have to say, I think because of part of the staff that we carry in this district, our custodial staff and our maintenance staff, I don't think if it wasn't for their excellence in how they maintain and do their job, that you could actually push those repairs or those things out far as how we've been able to do it. Now we're up against time. We're up against some things that certainly have to be taken care of. But you have to commend the staff for their excellence in how they've maintained. The carpets are kind of bare, things need to be painted, but they have maintained buildings in an excellent manner. Every staff or teacher or administrator, when they walk into their buildings, they're walking into a clean, healthy learning environment. Our students are exposed to that on a daily basis, and that's excellence that we have to be proud of. And so I think the next question to help alleviate the burden of that is to come up with the ideas and strategies and plans that can be implemented that can cause it to be even greater. And I think the dialogue that we have around the table tonight, I hope we can continue that and build on it, because it's important to us doing an excellent job for the Borough and for the school board. Thank you.
Mr. Dorn.
I'm going to also express a real appreciation for tonight. We've had lots of conversations. They've spanned weeks and months. But particularly today, I think, is a significant time for us really getting together. And the questions that you ask as Assembly members are really important for the whole community, because we have to be thinking about those and the answers. The questions that we ask and the ideas that each of us bring to the table makes a big difference. And there's so many common interests that we have. It's basically serving our community. But there are other questions. How much is the right amount for savings? And we don't want money just to sit someplace. And in some ways, I look at this and I say, well, for accounting, now why is that under unrestricted? Is the term? Versus, designated, but also that thoughtfulness has gone into it. And when Ms. Majors asked the question about the equipment fund, is a good one. It wasn't just to have something in savings, but it's for a particular, let's work towards this particular purpose. Yes, we can change it. Just, both our bodies can change things that by ordinance or by we don't have the ordinances, but we have other methods that we can switch. But the intent being that, yes, this is where we want it to go. And we do draw down from that equipment fund because actually in part of our operating plan this year is that there's money being taken from there to purchase equipment this year. Now, if we get a grant, we may not have to draw as much, and so we're always looking for those things. But the intent is not just to have it sit there, but yet to have something that we can draw on, especially as equipment is needed, and those things come to the fore. And so this conversation that we're having is just really thankful for everybody being here tonight and spending that time on it. And that we look forward, as has been said, is that we continue the conversation and the understanding and the good questions going back and forth. So, thank you.
Other comments? I guess we're closing out. Ms. Light, you haven't had a word to say tonight. Okay, I'll let you go next. And then Ms. Lejeski.
Well, I guess this is a kind of a big kind of open-ended question, but my takeaway from this as someone that has to consider this in 3 days is that we had that $7 million amount, and I feel like the message y'all are sending is 0 is the right amount. So then we have to figure out, do we say yes or no to that? But then that's all going to come back around to February. We still have all these maintenance issues going on. And, right away we look at our local contribution being $20 million, and that's above the required contribution. So it's a problem that, it's still there. So just more observation, I guess.
Let's see, any other hands? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Lejeski. I did tell you were next. I didn't write it down. I'm sorry. And Ms. Williams?
I got a couple of sort of relevant facts, but I might need some reminding on one of them from Debbie or Jim here. But I remember, actually, I think it was you, Ms. Brady, you specifically said it. Was it Standard & Poor's or Moody's and the estimated or recommended reserve amount for a bonding school district? Was that 7%? And I forget who it was from.
Standard & Poor's and Moody's have two different criteria, and they're looking at school districts who can tax and bond and own facilities, and they have, one calls it an adequate fund balance, one calls it, I think, a moderate fund balance, and that 5% was in those Standard & Poor's and Moody's. 5% of expenditures is moderate, adequate under their ratings for school districts, and Moody's in particular went on to say that school districts, by their nature, even bonding, taxing, facility owning, school districts do not require as much fund balance as a general purpose government who has a much broader risk exposure.
Okay, so I guess I just wanted to make sure all the school board members were aware that the outgoing Mayor Castle, I guess he's already gone, but he's still in the community. He's still here. But anyway, I think he brought that up as like a core piece of relevant facts for when considering the ordinance that we're, and by the way, we won't necessarily consider it on Thursday. We could vote to not consider it, but he brought that up, and so you combine that with a couple of other factors, but one is, and I'm sure many people in this room wish they would have gone the other way. I'm not one of them, but it doesn't matter. But the ballot initiatives, right? There was one for bonding, which would have brought in more money to help address the big elephant in the room is what, we don't know exactly, $300 million of deferred maintenance. And I don't know how much of property is being used by the school district versus for other borough functions, but I have no doubt that the school district portion is significant, very significant. I don't know if you've got a number at the top of your head, but I'm guessing at least 25, 50%, somewhere in there. But, oh, it's 75. Okay, I'm off by a lot. So the methods of raising taxes via bonds, via special FMR, increase to tax cap, those things are gone. And so I said this at the last meeting. I don't think Carl Castle was trying to throw anyone under the bus, but this will sum it up the best. You guys have all heard a stitch in time saves 9. Mr. Williams brought it up in different words at our last meeting. He's saying that if we don't spend a bunch of money on deferred maintenance, it's going to grow at an escalating rate, compounding interest and things. So anyway, I mean, we got this up potentially in a couple days, and these are some of the really relevant things in my mind, and I'm glad we had this meeting, same as everyone else, but I don't know. I wish I could have heard a little more from all the board members. Maybe we will, and that's a good reason for more meetings. But
Dr. Gabor? Oh, I was just going to say, something to keep in mind is, again, the potential return of capital funding in 2020 potential. So, saving some of these projects for if a reimbursement program is going to come back. So it's just something to keep in mind in terms of, long-term costs. And I know it's just kicking the can down the road, and we don't want to maybe do that 100%. But I think, when our facilities department is looking at some of these projects and when to spend money, and that's something that's always in the back of our mind. So
I have Ms. Williams next.
I'm super appreciative of the desire to store money in funds to be able to prepare for the future. But as a parent in the district, one of the things I found very confusing in all of this discussion of the fund balances, especially the unrestricted general fund balance, is it feels like simultaneously the message we were getting from the district is we need to cut teachers, we need to cut staff, we can't afford to have custodial service to the level we might want in some of our buildings, and simultaneously there's an $18 million pot of money in the unrestricted general fund, and I have a real hard time squaring these numbers. So I think that may be also driving some of the concern is the message from the district is we don't have enough money, we can't support all the things we need to do, and yet there's this large pile of money in the general fund that is not being spent year over year that was asked for in the budget. So I don't know if there's things you can help me understand this better.
Well, I think Mr. DeGraw walked through most of those, again, and what those were about, in terms of risk management, equipment, those sort of things, and it takes, so staffing, teachers, support staff, that's part of a school district budget. There's other parts of a school district budget, and, those are never the ones that we spend a lot of time talking about, but, we have to shore those up and take care of those as well. So, again, the school board makes decisions about how to spend these funds, and you have to understand too, when you are advocating for funding from the state, you have to play the game. right? You have to play the game. The only thing that gets anybody's attention is class size. So I'm going to talk about, potential teacher cuts and, potential class size increases to get the attention of legislators to hopefully add money to the BSA. Oftentimes they won't because they don't want those funds to go into salaries. They don't want the money that they give the school district to then go to salary increases. And so that will be a very interesting political dynamic as we go into negotiations with 3 bargaining units in January. To talk about buildings, to talk about equipment, none of that, that doesn't get the moms to advocate in Juneau for funding. So again, there's the political reality of how you advocate at the state level for those sort of things. When they do give us money, so specifically, it wasn't last year, it was perhaps the year before, extra funding was specifically dedicated to transportation. So sometimes these things come through other mechanisms than the BSA. So anyway, there's not a simple answer to that question. I think, again, we attempt to present a very fiscally responsible budget. We're also at the same time trying to advocate for money and in a very politically volatile climate. So.
Well, I got a list going, but you want me to add you, Ms. Allison? Okay. Mr. Tackey was next.
Perfect. Actually, I think you just articulated that you use pink slips then for political sway is kind of alarming, but that's not my main point. Is I wanted to talk about what point we were at in this meeting. You mentioned that we were wrapping things up. I didn't know we went from stepping from presentation on the budget process to specifically discussing this ordinance. But if that's the case, that we did move to this, then I would like to see something more specific, or what do you see for a solution then to this? Like what tweaks or amendments to this ordinance, or how would you like to see a lapse fund operate? I feel like we kind of lack, we didn't have any presentation on what your guys' expectations are.
So if I can, I think my response to that is to hit pause on this so that we can spend some time on that with administration. That's not a conversation that's going to, we've spent all our time trying to understand the impact of the ordinance, trying to articulate what our 4-year plan looks like, trying to explain the mechanisms of that. We haven't been able to spend any time forward looking. So that's going to require time. That it might require a few months. Again, recognizing that there are deadlines coming up in terms of planning for potential summer projects. But to me, that is a longer conversation. And part of the problem is when you don't get to have the conversation, you're just handed an ordinance and you have 30 days to respond. You don't have an opportunity to get there. So I would like to be able to get there.
I would like to see the ordinance be put on hold, as Dr. Bork has stated. And the reason being is because it was just given to us, and the expectations haven't been fielded out to the board members, for one. Second of all, if you hold on to it for a little while and we can iron out some of our differences, I think it would be a better outcome. I mean, a lot of you have a lot of questions. We could go on until midnight tonight, and I don't think we would resolve everyone's questions here at the table. But I think it's a starting point, as I stated before. We have to start somewhere, and we can keep moving on. And I know nobody wants to keep kicking the can down the road, as your saying is. It's not my saying. But we have to start somewhere, and I think this is a good start. I think the more that we talk about our situations on both sides of the board, I think we can come to some conclusions. And my next person, because I jumped ahead of somebody, is Ms. Moriarty. I'm going to get there.
You keep trying. I just wanted to thank the assembly members, mayor, the school district admin throughout the room, and my fellow board members for coming together for such an important conversation. To answer Mr. Lujewski's question, I am open to talking about funding the building maintenance reserve fund. And to answer Mr. Quist, yes, that's over 0. To answer Ms. Major's question, I'm open to several different methods of coming to a number. that would benefit both bodies here tonight. But most importantly, I am most looking forward to what Mayor Bryce suggested of planning and working together. I know that a lot of Assembly members tonight have been asking for numbers, and that's not possible without more time to plan. And so giving us the time, putting this on hold and giving us the time to come up with that will only benefit everybody in the long run. It'll get you your numbers that you want, and it'll give us time to put that planning process together. But I do thank everybody for coming today and talking. That's been the best part.
Next I have is Mr. Dorn.
Couple of things. One for Ms. Brady. Your reference to Moody's and what's the other one? Standard & Poor's. If I remember during the finance work session at the Assembly Chambers, you did indicate that they are using their numbers, their percentages as credit rating companies, not necessarily as accounting or recommendations. So that's what they look at for doing credit rating, which is a little different purpose. I don't know the numbers will be different, but
that's true. They're used for credit rating purposes for districts that are in higher risk exposure scenarios, in that they have to worry about their facilities, they have to worry about other things like natural disasters affecting their operations, which our school district would not. I also in that presentation talked about the Government Finance Officers Association, which is the accounting side of things, and what their best practices say. And their best practices also recognize a difference between a general purpose government and a special purpose government, and that you need to look at each entity and what their risk exposures are, and then decide what your fund balance needs to be.
Okay, thank you. And I think in terms of what we'd like to see here, and one of the things that excites me here is we put some questions on the table that we have to answer. And that listening to Mayor Ward and Superintendent Work saying that, there are things that they really can talk about and need to talk about. And I think giving that an opportunity, because we need to get that conversation, and we need to address the questions of, the finance, the building maintenance. We need to address the question of that plan. What's the good number? What makes sense, and to be able to explain it not only to all of us in this room, but that the community understands it, and it makes sense to the community. And the bottom line is that it's benefiting kids. And so I think having those opportunities, that's what I'm looking for, and that the questions that have come up and that I know have been noted down, that they're not just questions that stop tonight, that those are the questions that we're really getting to kind of the meat and potatoes of things, and to say, okay, we need to continue and make sure we get the answers for those. Some of that is going to be an administration conversation, because they know some of the more particulars and specifics of that. Some of it is going to be at the board and assembly levels, since we set policy. But that's what I'm really hoping is, and what I'm really been excited about is that, we've got the questions really on the table. If we leave them there, we've failed. We've got to address them. And I've heard, from the administration, both sides say they've noted that, and they're saying, yes, we have to talk about that, and I'd like to give them that chance.
Okay, next I have is Ms. Majors.
So I'll just, going back to the ordinance then, how much time does the school board or the school district feel that they need to provide a valuable response? And I'll just maybe preface that by saying I don't always believe that there's a correlation with the more time you have, the better product you put out. Sometimes that doesn't always hold true either. So I think, we certainly don't want to find ourselves in the situation that we spent last year in. And so how do we ensure that they're, that we're not just, as you said, kicking this can down the road, but, we're walking away with an idea of a reasonable expectation.
I would say, and I'm just speaking off the cuff, correct me if you think it's too short of a time frame, we have the holidays coming up. This is November, December. I would say by January, we should be able to give you all a clear answer on a lot of your questions that you've asked tonight. Do you all think January is too far out or not enough time? Or?
Well, I guess I need to understand the question, exactly what answers you're looking for. So if you're, again, you look at our budget process, and when the board submits its budget to the Assembly is April 1st. So it would make sense that as part of that, again, if we're going to do something that's forward-thinking, that would be built into that somewhere, be part of that conversation. But again, I think we just need to be sure that we give the board time to have these larger conversations around budget. So
if I could just clarify my question, right? So my question was, how much time do you need to respond to this ordinance? Because Mr. Tackey brought up the question about what are your thoughts on the ordinance specifically. The response was there wasn't enough time because there was only 30 days. So how much time is considered adequate time to look at this ordinance for the Assembly to decide whether or not it's something that they want to continue to pursue or potentially approve in some fashion?
That was what I was speaking to, the timeline for the ordinance more so than to look at everything encompassing. We can work on it as we go through. We have a budget that we have to present by April 1st, but it doesn't mean we have to stop our conversations of talking with one another to resolve some of the issues. And I think Mr. Cooper was next.
Thanks. So I think that there's several questions here that are on the table. One is, what's the appropriate level of fund balance going forward? One is, how do we fund maintenance? And I think the third question that the ordinance embodies and that the 4-year plan embodies is there's a sense, I'll just say it, speaking for myself, that the district has accumulated too much fund balance. And so now it's got this big dollar figure of fund balance sitting in its accounts. So what do we do with that? Do we do a 4-year spend down plan? Mayor Ward may be right that a 4-year spend down isn't the best way to do it. Or do we do something that the ordinance, effectively forces a shorter term spend down plan with different parameters, right? And so I think the question in my mind that needs to be answered either this Thursday or at some point in the future is, what do we do with that large fund balance that's sitting in the district's accounts? What's the best way to deal with that? Because I think that that's really the direct question is there's a large amount of money sitting there. What do we do with it? How do we utilize it? What's the best way forward? And that's the question in my mind that needs to be answered either in 3 days or January or whenever the Assembly decides to do that with the ordinance.
So I think a fast-track timeline is going to be challenging. Again, I think administration can have these conversations, but the board is going to need to be able to talk about these things as part of their budgeting process. So what level of fund balance should the school district carry? Again, that's a fundamental philosophical issue. I don't know that we're going to have an answer for you by January. Building maintenance, I think, is something that we can wrap our heads around fairly quickly and talk about, what that might look like. And again, the 4-year plan, to me, that's part of the budgeting process. And perhaps, I don't know if a policy is the right answer to that, but something a little bit more tangible. I don't see that I don't see our board being able to get that done, by January. But
Mr. Dorn was next in major. I'm sorry. See, it's getting past almost 9 o'clock. Mayor Bryce. Mr. Dorn. Or did you want him to go first?
He was first.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mr. Rice. We're going to go with Mayor Ward, and then we'll come to Mr. Rice, and then Mr. Dorn, okay? So you're passing up your turn, okay?
So I think to answer Mr. Cooper's questions on the fund balance and these kind of philosophical discussions that we have and questions for the school district are not going to be answered through this ordinance. And so looking at the budget process timeline, I think what could be appropriate is for that ordinance to be dealt with as the Assembly feels is appropriate, and then to put the expectation that that Dr. Gaborik and myself sit down and have conversations and then have a report back to our respective bodies in January. That would align with the budget process that the school district has moving forward for the next fiscal year. It would also, I think, give us the time to be able to deal with those philosophical issues and how we can come forward with a plan that works for the school district and for the borough.
Next I have is Mr. Rice.
Thank you. Well, just like my other board members, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who came out. But being a long-term board member on here, I'm going to say about time. I mean, this has been ongoing for too long. We're two different entities, and we affect too many people and too many employees here in the district. You were just talking about, we have this big pot of money and, we have to give out pink slips. Well, then you guys get people who come up and they say, oh, well, the school district needs more money. Well, right here is where we start talking about things. We just had a budget, just a quick, glance at what we're doing with the budget and the pay down and stuff like that. Wait until January, I'm going to agree with the mayor, wait until January is good for this ordinance, because once we start talking about, setting up some kind of scheduling for maintenance, that's going to, just change up some of the language in, your guys' ordinance, I believe. I could be wrong. But we need to all remember, and if we just take anything from here, is just be able to step away from these tables, think about what, we presented you, not just, the Borough Assembly, but board members as well, because now we start thinking about what you guys are wanting on this ordinance, start stepping away, make sure that we come back with each other, with the questions that we need, because I'm looking at Ms. Brady over here, Mr. Williams, the decisions that we make as borough assemblies and school district board members affects them, because we may be elected off, but these are the people who need to be able to carry this on and carry out the ideas and, the long-term goals, because I always think of Mr. Norm, with all the building maintenance and everything else, got to think of, the long-term, process for our budgeting and stuff like that. So, to me, right now we have, a little bit of more information that we'd be able to go away with right now and come back here in a couple months or, whenever for another meeting and be able to hash out some of the questions and some of the unanswered questions that we have right now.
Mr. Doran and Ms. Sanford, did you have your hand up? Okay. Mr. Doran.
I think that Mr. Cooper outlined really the real questions, and I think that's what has been very good tonight, is we've really gotten, I think, the bottom line questions that we need to answer and work on together. And that my concern with the ordinance is that it is a solution. It may not be the solution, and really may not answer the questions that we have on the table. What is appropriate unrestricted funds? What is an appropriate way of dealing with the school building maintenance? And so rather than do something, and I always keep having to come back to, this is an amended ordinance. There is a lapse ordinance in place. This amends it, puts it in a different way, it's another version of it. But is it solving the issue? And so really, I think we've helped to delineate what the issues are, at least the current issues, and really try to give administrations the opportunity to really work on some answers and possibilities to that. And to bring those back to both of our bodies so that we can consider and deliberate those things, rather than just putting in a sense a Band-Aid that we may rip off a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, but rather try to put the time in so we don't get into these battles. And I know ever since the lapse was put in, it's always been kind of, is this serving the purpose of what was being tried? Those questions have really been there for 10 years. And so I think this is a really good opportunity for us to have that real clear conversation about the root issues, and that's where I really like seeing the opportunity for the both administrations to talk about those issues. We've got them on the table, and then bring back some possibilities to both our entities so we can really solve the problems, right, rather than just putting a Band-Aid on it.
Anyone else? Well, I want to thank everyone for showing up today. I think it's been a good meeting. It's a starting point. I don't know how many times I've said that tonight, but it is a starting point. And I think we as adults living in the Fairbanks area understand the needs. We all want our students educated, and we are looking forward to doing a better plan and working together better than we have in the past. So all we have to look forward to is moving forward. We do have new people on board, which is Mr. DeGraw. He's a Fairbanksan. He's been away for a while, but he started out here in Fairbanks, I believe, and he knows what Fairbanks is about. We're not big city, we're not little city, but we're right there in the middle. And we just need to work together and resolve our issues. Anything else before I ask for a motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn? Somebody needs to say it. Okay. Thank you all very much.